She torched my land to drive me out. The fire burned down her 15 villas instead. I watched from my driveway as orange flames swallowed my wooden fence, my garden shed, my grandmother's rose bushes, and I already knew exactly who lit the match. The whole neighborhood smelled like gasoline and power. Margaret Holloway, HOA president, self-appointed queen of Maplewood Estates, stood at the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn, arms folded, watching the fire trucks arrive. She didn't even bother hiding the satisfaction on her face. She thought she'd finally won. What she didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that the wind had already shifted. By sunrise, 15 of her luxury villas would be nothing but ash and twisted iron, and the arson investigator would be standing on her doorstep with handcuffs. My name is Claire Navarro. I'm 38, a landscape architect, and I moved to Maplewood Estates in Chandler, Arizona, 3 years ago with my daughter Lily and my dog, Biscuit. I bought the corner lot on Sycamore Ridge Drive because it had space, good light, and a view of the desert hills. I thought I'd finally found home. Lily was 10 then, just starting 5th grade, already obsessed with drawing floor plans of imaginary houses. My ex-husband Marcus had moved to Portland, so it was just the two of us and Biscuit making it work. I took on freelance projects, fixed up the house slowly, planted a garden that I was quietly proud of. The neighborhood looked peaceful from the outside. Wide streets, desert landscaping, the occasional coyote at dusk. People kept to themselves but waved from their driveways. Nobody warned me about Margaret Holloway. I guess nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. I found out about the HOA on my 2nd week. A welcome packet arrived, stamped with a gold seal. Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association, Community Standards and Enforcement Guidelines. 47 pages. I set it on the counter and figured I'd read it someday. That was my first mistake. Margaret Holloway had lived in Maplewood Estates for 19 years. She'd been HOA president for 11 of them. 3 consecutive terms, each election running unopposed because nobody wanted the job badly enough to fight her for it. She owned 3 properties on the east side of the development, plus a separate portfolio of villas she rented out on the southeast parcel. I saw her for the first time at the community mailbox station, 2 weeks after I moved in. She was wearing a white linen blazer at 9 in the morning, sunglasses that cost more than my car payment, and she was studying me the way a hawk studies a field mouse before deciding whether to bother. She introduced herself pleasantly enough. "You're in the corner lot," she said. More statement than greeting. "The Hendersons' old place." I told her yes, I just moved in. She smiled and said, "That lot has always been a bit complicated." Then she walked away before I could ask what she meant. I learned quickly what complicated meant. The corner lot, my lot, sat adjacent to a strip of undeveloped land that Margaret had been lobbying the city to annex into the HOA's common area for years. The Hendersons had refused to cooperate. Now I was in the same position, except I didn't know it yet. The undeveloped strip was about 40 feet wide, running along the south edge of my property. It was technically city land, a drainage easement, but Margaret had long-term plans to build a gated entrance feature there, which would require rerouting the easement and buying out adjacent owners. My corner lot was the key piece she needed. My neighbor to the north, an older man named Dale Pruitt, told me about it one Saturday afternoon while I was raking. "She's been circling that lot for years," he said, nodding toward the strip. "Tried to lowball the Hendersons twice. They said no both times. That's why she made their life miserable until they sold." I stared at him. "She made them sell?" He shrugged. "I can't prove it. Nobody can." I didn't take the warning seriously enough. I was busy. A new city project had come in. Lily needed new school supplies. The back porch screen had a hole Biscuit kept squeezing through. I told myself Margaret was just a type I'd dealt with before. the control freak who needed managing. I thought I knew how to handle types like her. The first official contact came 6 weeks after I moved in. A formal letter from the HOA on heavy cream stationery, informing me that my front yard planter boxes were non-compliant with Article 7, Section 3B of the Community Aesthetic Standards. The planter boxes were cedar, freshly built, and I thought they looked great. I photographed them, read Article 7, Section 3B, and wrote back explaining that cedar was explicitly listed as an approved material. The dimensions were within code, and the paint color, a warm terracotta, matched 3 other homes on the street. I attached photos, measurements, and references. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived. This time the violation was my unapproved gravel pathway along the east fence line. The gravel was the same decomposed granite that half the neighborhood used. I'd seen Margaret's own front yard had it. I photographed hers and included it in my reply. The next letter arrived faster. By month 4, I'd received 11 violation notices. The targeted specificity was almost artistic. The angle of my satellite dish, the species of one succulent in my garden bed, the shade of my exterior trim, which they claimed was warm ivory, when the approved code specified natural ivory. I started keeping a binder. My neighbor Renata Osei, who lived 2 doors down, knocked on my door one evening with a bottle of wine. "I've been watching them send you letters," she said. "You need to understand, this isn't about compliance. She does this to people she wants gone." I poured 2 glasses and listened. Renata had been a Maplewood resident for 6 years. She'd been through her own wave of notices when she'd first pushed back on a parking dispute. "The trick," she said, "is not to show weakness, but also not to escalate too fast. Document everything, and get on the HOA meeting agenda. Once you're visible and documented, she's more careful." I nodded and wrote it all down. I requested the HOA's financial records, as was my right under the CC and RS. Margaret's assistant, a mousy woman named Cheryl who always looked mildly apologetic, emailed me a response saying the records were under annual review and unavailable for 30 days. I noted the date and waited. 30 days passed. I re-requested. The response said the review was ongoing. I looked up Arizona HOA statutes and found that members were entitled to records within 10 business days. I sent a third request citing the statute. The records arrived within 48 hours. A thick PDF, clearly organized to obscure anything useful. What I could piece together was interesting, though. The HOA's landscaping maintenance budget had nearly doubled in Margaret's last term, with a single vendor receiving almost all contracts. Holloway Green Services, LLC. I searched the Arizona Business Registry. Holloway Green Services was registered to a man named Robert Holloway, Margaret's husband. I noted it. I didn't act yet. I needed to understand the full picture before I made any move, and I was still in the phase of learning the terrain. But something had shifted in how I saw the situation. This wasn't just about planter boxes and gravel paths. There was money involved. There was power. And I was sitting on a piece of land she wanted badly. Margaret called me directly in month 5, a rare breach of her usual letter and proxy style. Her voice was warm and professionally friendly, like a realtor who senses hesitation. She wanted to grab coffee and talk about the neighborhood vision. I said sure. We met at the Starbucks on Ray Road on a Tuesday morning. She ordered a flat white and launched directly into a prepared speech about Maplewood's long-term community development goals. She showed me renderings on her iPad. A grand gated entrance, mature olive trees, a stone water feature, all anchored on the strip of land adjacent to my lot. She made it sound inevitable. Then she mentioned that a few properties might need to be reconfigured to accommodate the plan, and she looked at me steadily. I asked what reconfigured meant for my lot specifically. She smiled and said it was just a matter of adjusting the southern boundary by about 40 feet. I stared at her. 40 feet was my garden, half my side yard, and the area where Lily liked to set up her telescope. I said calmly that I wasn't interested in adjusting any boundaries. Her smile didn't change, but something behind her eyes went flat. She said she understood, and that she'd give me time to consider the community benefit. She paid for both coffees. I drove home with a feeling in my chest like before a thunderstorm. That specific pressure, that silence before something breaks. I called Renata that evening and told her what happened. There was a pause on the line, and then Renata said, "She's already decided. Now it's just a matter of how she does it." The violation letters resumed at double the previous rate. Now they arrived certified mail, requiring my signature, a deliberate escalation to formalize every notice as a legal record. Margaret was building a paper trail. My binder grew thicker. I cataloged every letter, cross-referenced every regulation, and responded to each one in writing within 5 business days. I also hired an HOA attorney, a woman named Sandra Chu who had a reputation in the Phoenix area for taking on exactly these kinds of cases. Sandra reviewed my binder on a Thursday afternoon and said, with no particular drama, "She's creating grounds for a lien. If the violations stack up unpaid, she can place a lien on your property. In some cases, HOAs have used liens to force a sale." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Sandra told me the best defense was aggressive documentation, presence at HOA meetings, and building alliances with other homeowners. "You're not the first person she's done this to," Sandra said. "You need to find the others." I left her office with a legal strategy, a growing sense of what I was actually dealing with, and a determination that had replaced whatever anxiety I'd felt walking in. Margaret Holloway wanted my land. She wasn't going to get it. The August HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige stucco building next to the pool. I arrived early and signed up for open comment. There were about 30 homeowners present, the regulars I gathered, since most residents never bothered attending. Margaret sat at the head table in a cream blazer, flanked by the treasurer and secretary, looking entirely in charge of the room. When my name was called for comment, I walked to the microphone with my binder and read a prepared statement. I noted that I had received 23 violation notices in 5 months, that each had been formally responded to with documented compliance, and that I had reason to believe the enforcement pattern constituted selective harassment. The room went quiet. Margaret's expression didn't flicker, but Cheryl's pen stopped moving. I finished my statement and returned to my seat. The room stayed quiet for a beat longer than felt natural. Then Margaret thanked me for my comment and moved on to the next agenda item as if I'd read aloud a grocery list. But I noticed something. 3 other homeowners, people I didn't know, were watching me with expressions that weren't neutral. They were watching me the way people watch someone say out loud something they've only thought quietly. After the meeting, a man named Gilbert Torres approached me in the parking lot. He was in his 60s, soft-spoken, owned one of the mid-block properties. He told me his wife had gone through something similar 4 years ago, right before a health crisis forced them to sell a second property they'd owned nearby. "We never connected the dots at the time," he said. "Now I wonder." He handed me his number and walked away. I called Gilbert the next day. His wife, Rosa, told me the whole story. 18 months of violations, a lien threat, mounting legal fees, and the stress of it all arriving during her cancer treatment. They'd sold the adjacent lot to a development company. The company, she'd found out later, was connected to a property management firm in Scottsdale. She'd never looked further into who owned it. I wrote down every detail. Sandra Chu ran the name of the Scottsdale firm. Took her 2 days. The firm was a subsidiary of a holding company called Desert Ridge Capital Partners. Desert Ridge Capital Partners had two listed members. One was a commercial real estate attorney named Vincent Marsh. The other was Robert Holloway, Margaret's husband. The land the Torres family had sold at a distressed price had gone, in effect, to Margaret. I sat with that information for a day before telling anyone. It was too clean to be coincidence and too documented to be speculation. Margaret wasn't just enforcing community standards. She was running a coordinated scheme to distress adjacent property owners until they sold cheaply, then capturing those properties through her husband's shell companies. I had financial records, public registry data, and a pattern across at least 2 properties. Possibly more. Sandra told me we needed more. 1 victim isn't a pattern. 2 is suspicious. 3 or more with documented timelines, linked back to the same acquisition chain, that's fraud. She was right. I needed to find more people. I drafted a short, careful letter and slipped it into the mailboxes of every homeowner on the east and southeast side of Maplewood who'd lived there more than 5 years. The letter said simply, if you have experienced an unusual pattern of HOA violations, lien threats, or pressure to sell property in or adjacent to Maplewood Estates, I would like to speak with you privately. I am working with legal counsel. Your identity will be protected. I included my number and a Proton Mail address. I dropped the letters on a Sunday morning before most people were up. By Tuesday, I had 4 responses. By Friday, 7. Each told a version of the same story with different names, different lots, different years. Violation storms out of nowhere. Pressure to sell. Offers that came seemingly from nowhere at exactly the right time, always from the same cluster of LLCs. One woman had kept meticulous records. Another had photographed a meeting between Robert Holloway and a buyer that happened in her own driveway, uninvited, while the violations were still active. The September HOA board meeting arrived before I'd finished compiling everything. I hadn't planned to move yet, but Margaret forced my hand. At that meeting, she introduced a new agenda item, a formal motion to place a $14,000 lien on my property for cumulative unresolved violations. I hadn't been notified in advance, which was itself a procedural violation of the HOA's own bylaws. I stood up before she finished reading the motion and stated, clearly, that the lien had not been noticed as required under Article 18, Section 2 of the CC&RS, and that I was formally objecting to the vote. Margaret told me, with the calm of someone who had done this before, that the board had discretion over notice timelines in urgent enforcement situations. I asked her to cite the specific provision. She couldn't. The vote was 3-2 in favor of the lien, Margaret plus her 2 allies on the board, against 2 members who looked genuinely uncomfortable. I noted the names of all 5 for Sandra. On my way out of the meeting, a woman I didn't recognize stopped me. She was mid-50s, sharp eyes, carrying a legal pad. I'm Martha Green, she said. I own the 4 villas on Southeast Parcel D. I think we need to talk. Martha Green had lived in Maplewood for 12 years. She was a retired paralegal, meticulous and unflappable, and she had noticed 3 years ago that the Southeast parcels, the ones Margaret's husband kept trying to aggregate, were being systematically devalued by code enforcement targeting. She'd been watching, documenting, but hadn't had enough to act. She looked at my binder and her eyes lit up the way a professional's eyes do when they see exactly what they needed. We met at Martha's kitchen table the following Saturday. She had her own binder, thicker than mine. She had tax records, a timeline of violation notices correlated with property sale dates, and a spreadsheet mapping the LLC structures back to Desert Ridge Capital Partners. She'd identified 7 properties that had been funneled through Margaret's network. 7 families who'd sold under pressure. Tens of thousands of dollars in value extracted across a decade. Martha had one piece I didn't. She'd attended a city planning commission meeting 18 months ago where Margaret had presented the proposed entrance feature project. During that meeting, Margaret had casually mentioned that the necessary property consolidations were already in progress. At the time, Martha thought it was a figure of speech. Now she understood it was a project status update. I brought Sandra into the conversation. The three of us met on a Tuesday evening, Sandra, Martha, and I, at Sandra's office on Elliott Road, with the full compilation of everything we'd gathered. Sandra was quiet for a long time, reading through the documents. Then she said, "This is wire fraud and HOA fiduciary breach at minimum, possibly more. We should be talking to the Arizona Attorney General's office and a federal housing attorney." I felt something shift in the room. Sandra spent the next week making calls. She had a contact at the AG's office who handled real estate fraud cases. She also reached out to a federal HUD attorney who specialized in HOA-related predatory schemes. Both were interested. Both asked for everything we had. We began the process of assembling a formal complaint package. Quietly, carefully, without tipping anything to Margaret. But then Margaret did something unexpected, or maybe entirely predictable in retrospect. She called a special emergency HOA meeting, citing a community safety concern. The notice went out on a Thursday for a Saturday meeting. Homeowners who showed up found themselves presented with a vote on a new rule, a blanket ban on unapproved structures within 30 feet of the southern boundary easement. My garden shed sat 22 feet from that boundary. The vote passed 4-1, the one dissenter being a new board member named Kevin Park, who had run a quiet campaign to fill a vacant seat 2 months ago and who I'd quietly encouraged to run. Kevin voted no and asked for the architectural basis for the 30-foot rule. Margaret said it was based on fire safety considerations and easement integrity. Kevin asked for the engineering report. Margaret said it was pending finalization. After the meeting, Kevin pulled me aside and said, "She's not going to wait for the engineering report. She's going to issue you a demolition notice for the shed within 2 weeks." He was right. The notice arrived on day 10. I had 30 days to remove the structure or face a daily fine plus escalating lien activity. Sandra said we could challenge it, but the clock was ticking and Margaret knew it. I had the shed appraised. It was a custom-built cedar and steel structure, 12 by 16 feet, with electrical, insulation, and built-in cabinetry that I designed myself. Replacement value was $11,000. I took photographs of every inch of it, submitted a formal appeal to the board, and simultaneously had Sandra file a motion in Maricopa County Superior Court challenging the lien as procedurally defective. The court filing got Margaret's attention. I know because Cheryl called me. Not emailed, called, to ask if we could find a resolution before this gets complicated. I told Cheryl I was happy to discuss resolution and asked her to have Margaret's attorney contact Sandra. There was a pause on the line, and Cheryl said, very quietly, "I'm sorry, Claire. I really am." It was the first time anyone connected to Margaret had said anything remotely human to me. I thought about Cheryl's apology for a long time afterward. There was something in her voice that felt less like regret about the situation and more like a specific, personal warning. But I didn't understand it fully then. I logged it and moved on to preparing for the court motion. The legal machinery was now in motion. I thought the worst was over. I was dangerously wrong. The court motion bought me a temporary stay on the lien, but Margaret responded by doubling down on every other front. Within a week of the filing, she distributed a community newsletter, printed on HOA letterhead, delivered to every home, describing ongoing legal disputes with a property owner who is refusing to comply with community safety standards. She didn't use my name, but she didn't need to. Everyone knew. Lily came home from school one afternoon and said a kid in her class had asked if it was true that our house was making the neighborhood unsafe. I sat down with her at the kitchen table and tried to explain it in language that was honest without being frightening. Lily listened, nodded, and then said with 10-year-old directness, "So she's lying?" I said it was more complicated than that. Lily said, "Sounds like lying." She wasn't wrong. My freelance clients started receiving unsolicited emails. I found out because one of them, a city parks department project manager named Darnell Hughes, called me personally to say he'd gotten an anonymous email claiming I had active code violations and ongoing legal disputes that may affect professional licensing. It was unsigned, sent from a generic Gmail address, and contained enough specific detail about my HOA case to be unmistakably sourced from inside the process. Darnell told me he was ignoring it and that he knew good work when he saw it. But a smaller private client, a couple redoing their backyard in Tempe, quietly informed me they were going in a different direction. I couldn't prove the same email had reached them, but the timing was precise. Margaret was reaching outside the neighborhood now. This was no longer just about a shed or a boundary line. Sandra escalated our complaint to include tortious interference with business relationships. We now had a legal theory that went beyond HOA disputes into civil damages. But civil litigation was slow and expensive, and Margaret knew it. She could sustain this war of attrition far longer than I could. She had the HOA's fee income, her husband's business revenue, and 19 years of built-in political goodwill in the community. What I had was documentation, 2 allies, and the quiet support of maybe a dozen residents who were too scared to say anything publicly. I needed to change that calculus. I needed people to stop being afraid. And to do that, I needed to show them that Margaret could actually be beaten, which meant I needed to win something visible in public before the community's eyes. The October HOA meeting was my first real opportunity. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing with Martha and Kevin. We had a motion ready, a call for an independent financial audit of HOA accounts, citing the conflict of interest concerns around Holloway Green Services. Under the CC&RS, any motion supported by at least 15% of total HOA membership had to be placed on the agenda. I had 19 signatures. The required threshold was 14. I submitted the motion through proper channels 2 weeks before the meeting. Margaret's response came through Cheryl. The motion was under legal review and might not qualify for the agenda due to procedural irregularities. I sent a certified letter citing the exact bylaw provision and informing the board that failure to place a qualifying motion on the agenda was itself a sanctionable violation. The motion appeared on the agenda. The October meeting drew 38 homeowners, nearly triple the usual attendance. Word had spread. People who'd been silent for years showed up with arms folded and faces carefully neutral, watching to see how this would go. Margaret opened the meeting with her usual composed authority, moving efficiently through agenda items as if the room weren't charged with something close to collective held breath. When the audit motion came up, I walked to the microphone and laid it out plainly. The HOA had been paying a single landscaping vendor, Holloway Green Services, LLC, approximately $140,000 per year over the past 3 years. That vendor was registered to Margaret's husband. The HOA's own bylaws prohibited board members from approving contracts with entities in which they had a direct financial interest. I asked for a yes or no vote on an independent audit. Margaret didn't flinch. She said the contracts had been disclosed and approved by the full board in closed session. Kevin Park, from the board table, quietly stated that he had not been on the board during those sessions and had never seen any disclosure documentation. The treasurer, a man named Gary who had always seemed to be operating on low-level discomfort, shuffled papers without speaking. The vote on the audit motion was 22 in favor, 6 against. Margaret declared the motion non-binding and said the board would take it under advisement. The room erupted. People who'd been sitting in silence for an hour started talking over each other. An older woman in the back row stood up and said loudly, "You work for us, Margaret. We pay your operating budget. You don't get to ignore a vote." Margaret held up one hand like a school principal requesting silence. Then she said something I will never forget. "This community has thrived under consistent, professional leadership. I would ask members to trust the process rather than acting on misinformation from parties who have their own legal and financial interests in disrupting our governance." She looked directly at me when she said it. 22 people had just voted against her, and she was accusing me of disruption. I held her gaze and said nothing. I didn't need to. The room was doing the work now. After the meeting, 7 people I'd never spoken to before came up and introduced themselves, asked for my contact information, said they'd been waiting years for someone to push back this clearly. 2 of them mentioned properties they'd sold under pressure. 2 mentioned violation notice campaigns that had mysteriously stopped when they'd agreed to minor concessions. The pattern kept widening. Martha and I spent 2 weeks following up with the new contacts. We were building a formal victim network now, 12 households with documented experiences, 5 of them with records detailed enough to anchor a fraud complaint. Sandra prepared sworn declarations for each household, carefully structured for the AG's office and the federal housing attorney, who had now officially opened a preliminary review. Margaret, meanwhile, was not standing still. She called in her political capital. The HOA's law firm, a Scottsdale outfit called Prescott and Webb, sent Sandra a letter threatening to countersue me for defamation based on my public statements at the October meeting. The letter was aggressive, detailed, and clearly expensive to draft. I read it with Sandra and felt a specific kind of anger, the kind that comes from seeing someone use power to punish truth. Sandra said not to worry about Prescott and Webb. Their letter is a flex, not a case. Every claim you made at that meeting is documented. Defamation requires false statements of fact. Everything you said was accurate and sourced. She paused. What concerns me more is what they're not filing. A fraud target who can afford Prescott and Webb usually lawyers up when they're about to be formally investigated. They know something is coming. She was right to be concerned. The following week, the Arizona AG's office sent a quiet inquiry letter to the HOA requesting records pertaining to vendor contracts, property transactions, and board conflict of interest disclosures going back 8 years. It wasn't a subpoena yet, but it was the first official government document in the chain. When Cheryl called me again, her voice had changed. She sounded like someone standing at the edge of something very deep. "I need to talk to you," Cheryl said. "Not about the HOA, not about Margaret. I mean, about me." I asked if she wanted to come to my house. She said no, somewhere neutral. We met at a coffee shop on McClintock Drive on a gray Thursday morning. She ordered nothing and kept her hands wrapped around her purse strap. She looked like someone who'd been rehearsing this conversation for weeks. Cheryl had been Margaret's assistant for 6 years. In that time, she'd processed violation notices, drafted letters, maintained the LLC documentation, scheduled meetings with buyers, and handled logistics for the entire operation. She hadn't fully understood, she said, what she was participating in, or she told herself she hadn't. Recently, she'd received her own certified letter from the AG's office. She was terrified. I listened without speaking for almost 20 minutes. Then I asked if she would be willing to speak to Sandra and potentially provide a formal statement. She said she needed to think about it. I didn't push. I gave her Sandra's card and told her that cooperation would matter significantly if and when formal charges were brought. She left the coffee shop quickly without looking back. 3 days later, she called Sandra directly. Cheryl's decision to cooperate changed the geometry of everything. She had direct knowledge of the scheme, names, dates, specific conversations, document trails. She'd been present in meetings where Margaret and Robert had discussed specific targets and timelines. She'd processed paperwork for the shell company transfers. Her declaration, combined with what we already had, gave the AG's office more than enough to open a formal investigation. Sandra got the call on a Wednesday afternoon. The AG's real estate fraud unit had formally opened an investigation into Margaret Holloway, Robert Holloway, Desert Ridge Capital Partners, and Holloway Green Services, LLC. The investigation was not yet public. We were asked to keep it that way. I sat in Sandra's office after she told me and felt, for the first time in months, that I was no longer alone in this fight. The state of Arizona was now on my side. But formal investigations take time. Months, sometimes years. And in the meantime, Margaret still held the HOA. She still had legal authority over my property, at least on paper. The lien was still being contested. The demolition notice for the shed was still active, stayed only by the court order. And I had a daughter, a dog, a mortgage, and a business to run while all of this played out. I wasn't out of danger. I was just finally not fighting alone. November brought cooler weather and a new development. The city of Chandler, responding to Martha's formal inquiry about the drainage easement along my southern boundary, sent an inspector to assess whether Margaret's proposed entrance feature project would require a conditional use permit. Margaret had told the city the project was still in planning stages. The inspector found evidence of grading and soil disruption along the easement edge, work that appeared to have begun without permits. I'd noticed the disruption in late October but hadn't understood what I was seeing. Subtle changes in the grade near the strip, tracks from what might have been a small skid steer, a section of brush cleared overnight. I'd taken photos because I took photos of everything now. I submitted them to the city inspector. He added them to his report. The city sent a stop work order and a citation to the HOA. Margaret denied any unauthorized work had been done. Kevin Park quietly pulled the HOA's maintenance log from the shared drive. He had access as a board member and found entries for drainage easement assessment and preliminary grading, south parcel, with Robert Holloway's landscape company listed as the contractor. The entries were buried in a long log file under miscellaneous expenses, labeled vaguely. Kevin exported the log, saved it offline, and gave a copy to Sandra. We now had evidence of unpermitted construction on a city easement, contracted to the president's husband's company, without board vote or disclosure. It was a separate violation from the fraud scheme but added to the picture. Sandra filed a complaint with the city's Development Services Department. The complaint triggered a formal review. Margaret was running out of front surfaces to present. The HOA board held an emergency closed session. Members only, no public attendance. I wasn't on the board, so I had no access. But Kevin was, and he texted me from inside. She's proposing to dissolve the current board and hold a snap election before the annual meeting. She says it's necessary to restore community confidence. She wants to lock in loyalists before the AG investigation becomes public. I stared at my phone and understood exactly what she was doing. A snap election with little notice would catch most homeowners off guard. Only Margaret's reliable supporters would show up, and she'd pack the board with people who owed her. Kevin and any other independent voices would be voted out. She'd reconstitute total control just as the formal investigation was gaining traction. It was elegant in a horrible way, preemptive, fast, designed to eliminate opposition at the exact moment she most needed it. I had 48 hours before the notice would go out. I spent those 48 hours making phone calls. Every person in my network, every contact Gilbert and Rosa Torres had, every household that had responded to my letter. I explained what was happening in plain terms and asked them to show up. I asked them to tell their neighbors. I said this was probably the most important HOA meeting any of us would ever attend, and that the outcome would determine whether this neighborhood belonged to its residents or to one person. The snap election notice went out on a Friday afternoon. The meeting was scheduled for Sunday morning, 40 hours later. Margaret almost certainly expected turnout of 20 to 25 people, mostly loyalists. She had done this calculation before. On Sunday morning, 61 homeowners showed up. I stood in the back of the room and counted them walking in. I had to stop my face from doing something undignified. Margaret opened the meeting and immediately moved to limit comment time to 30 seconds per person. Kevin Park objected under parliamentary procedure. The room erupted in support of Kevin's objection. Margaret gavelled for order. Someone in the back, I didn't see who, said clearly, "You don't own us, Margaret." The room went quiet in a way that was not the absence of conflict but the presence of something that had finally been named. The board election proceeded. Every Margaret-aligned candidate lost. Kevin Park was re-elected. 3 new board members were voted in, 2 women and 1 man, none of whom I'd specifically coordinated with, who had simply shown up furious and organized. The new board voted immediately to retain an independent auditor. Then they voted to suspend Margaret's enforcement authority pending the audit. Then they voted to freeze all pending liens, including mine, pending legal review. Margaret sat at the head table through all of it. She had her arms folded and her face arranged in an expression of calm that must have cost her something, because I could see the white of her knuckles from 10 feet away. When the last vote was announced, she stood, gathered her things with deliberate composure, and walked out of the room without a word. The door closed behind her and the room exhaled. But I knew, and I think everyone in that room knew, that Margaret Holloway didn't accept outcomes she hadn't scripted. She'd been doing this for 11 years. She had resources, connections, rage, and the specific, focused intelligence of someone who has never truly lost at anything and doesn't understand what it means to stop. We'd won the board. That was real. But the war was not over. It had just entered its most dangerous phase. The 2 weeks after the snap election felt like the first breath after a long dive. The immediate crisis had broken. The new board was professional, cooperative, and visibly relieved to be rid of Margaret's gravitational pull. Kevin walked me through the process for formally withdrawing the lien, which the new board voted to rescind at their first official meeting. Sandra confirmed the court motion was now moot. I let myself feel it, just for a day. I took Lily to South Mountain Park on a Saturday and we hiked the National Trail for 3 hours. She collected rocks and named them after planets. Biscuit ran in circles and annoyed every other hiker on the trail. The sky was that particular Arizona blue that exists nowhere else. Deep, saturated, impossibly large. For a few hours I didn't think about violation notices or LLC registries or the look on Margaret's face when the votes came in. I called my mother that evening. She lived in El Paso, had called me every week during the worst of it, mostly just to listen. I told her the worst seemed to be over. She said, "You sound tired." I said, "I am tired." She said, "Are you safe?" It was a strange question about an HOA dispute, but I understood what she was really asking. I said I thought so. I wasn't sure I was right. The new board's first audit finding came back within 10 days. The independent auditor identified $340,000 in payments to Holloway Green Services over 4 years that lacked proper board authorization. Not all of it was necessarily fraudulent. Some contracts predated the stricter documentation requirements, but enough was irregular to warrant referral to legal counsel. The auditor filed a preliminary report. The board shared it with Sandra. Sandra forwarded it to the AG's office. Martha Green came over one evening and we sat on my back porch with iced tea and went through the new material together. She was meticulous and a little giddy in the controlled way of someone who has been patient for a very long time. 7 families, she said. 7 families who lost money, sold under pressure, moved out of this neighborhood because of her. She tapped the table. 7 families who are going to get a call from the AG's office. Renata stopped by with tamales from a place on Dobson she'd been recommending since I moved in, and we ate in the kitchen while Lily did homework at the table, and Biscuit attempted to stage a tamale robbery from the floor. Felt almost normal. It felt like what I'd imagined this neighborhood might feel like before I understood what was underneath it. I let myself sit in that for a little while. But I was watching. I'd learned, over the past months, that the quiet moments in this situation were not rest. They were repositioning. Margaret had gone silent, which was not the same as having gone away. She hadn't attended the subsequent board meeting. Cheryl had been unreachable since her conversation with Sandra. Robert Holloway's truck hadn't appeared on the East parcels in 2 weeks. People who had been very busy were suddenly very still. Sandra called me on a Thursday and said the AG's office had issued preservation orders to the HOA's bank, to the LLC accounts, and to 2 title companies that had handled the shell company property transfers. Preservation orders meant a formal charge was likely imminent. Maybe weeks, maybe months. Margaret's attorney at Prescott and Webb had entered a formal appearance on her behalf in the matter, which meant she knew. She was lawyering up for criminal proceedings. Kevin texted me that Margaret had formally resigned from the HOA board. The resignation letter, per Kevin, was 2 sentences long. I resign effective immediately. The community has made its position clear. No apology. No acknowledgement of anything. Just the clean, calculated retreat of someone who understands when a position is untenable and moves to protect the next one. I read the text twice and felt uneasy rather than relieved. Retreat wasn't surrender. Not for her. The new board accepted her resignation and moved on. The easement issue with the city was still being resolved, but the city had determined the unauthorized grading was minor in scope and would be corrected without major legal action against the HOA itself. The board had cooperated fully, which helped. The city inspector submitted his final report. The unpermitted work had been minimal but real, and the citation would stand. Robert Holloway's company paid the fine. My shed was formally cleared. The new board voted unanimously to withdraw the demolition notice and strike the original violation from my record. Sandra sent me the confirmation in writing and noted that if I chose to pursue damages for the cost of legal fees and business interference, I had a reasonable case. I filed that away for later. For now, I just wanted to finish the garden wall I'd been planning since summer and hadn't started because I'd been living inside a legal siege. Lily and I spent a weekend clearing and prepping the south garden bed. She had strong opinions about where the climbing plants should go and explained her reasoning with the focused confidence of someone who fully expects to be taken seriously. We planted desert willow along the fence line, a climbing bougainvillea at the corner, and a row of lantana that would bloom orange and yellow by spring. I stood back and looked at it and felt something close to reclaimed. I had not heard from Margaret directly since the snap election. Not a letter, not a call, not through Cheryl. The silence was longer and more complete than anything in the previous months had been, and it had a different quality from the brief pauses between letter campaigns. It wasn't tactical regrouping. It was something I couldn't quite name, something between calculation and rage held very still. Gilbert Torres called me one evening and mentioned that a truck had been seen on the access road behind the southeast parcels, the road that ran along the undeveloped strip near my south boundary. He hadn't gotten a plate. The truck had been there twice in the early morning. Probably nothing, he said, and then didn't say anything for a moment. I wrote it down. I told myself it was probably nothing. I didn't entirely believe that. The night before everything changed, I sat on the back porch after Lily was asleep. The desert air was cold and dry and smelled like creosote and distant smoke, the kind of ambient smoke that lives in Arizona air in late fall, from someone's fireplace somewhere. Biscuit lay against my legs. The neighborhood was quiet. I had documents filed with the state, a functional board in place, a legal ally I trusted, and a garden that was finally starting to look like mine. I thought maybe the worst really is over. I thought it with everything I had. The call came at 2:17 in the morning. My phone lit up on the nightstand and I grabbed it in that suspended half-second between sleep and alarm. It was Dale Pruitt, my neighbor to the north. Claire. His voice was strange, flat in a specific way. There's a fire. Your south fence. You need to get out now. I was moving before he finished the sentence. I grabbed Lily from her bed. She woke immediately, no questions, just grabbed my arm. And I called for Biscuit, who was already at the front door, hackles up, pacing. I got all three of us outside and across the driveway in under 2 minutes. From the street, I could see the orange glow beyond the south side of the house. The cedar fence was fully involved. The garden shed, newly cleared, finally officially mine, was burning. The Chandler Fire Department arrived in 7 minutes. By then, the fence line was gone and the shed was a frame of black timbers. The garden bed, the bougainvillea, the desert willow, the lantana lily and I had planted 3 weeks ago, was scorched along the south edge. The firefighters contained the fire before it reached the house. I stood in the driveway with my arms around my daughter and my dog pressed against my legs and watched the hoses hit the embers. The fire investigator on scene that night was a woman named Inspector Hallie Diaz. She was thorough, calm, and did not ask leading questions. She walked the burn area with a flashlight for 40 minutes, taking photographs and flagging points with small orange markers. When she came back to where I was standing, she told me the burn pattern showed a clear point of origin along the south fence base, and that the perimeter near the origin point showed signs consistent with accelerant use. They would do full lab analysis in the morning. Accelerant. I heard the word and held it. Not an electrical fault. Not a dry bush catching a stray spark. Someone had put something on my fence and lit it. I thought of the truck Gilbert had mentioned, the early morning sightings on the access road. I thought of Margaret's white knuckles at the election table. I thought of Cheryl's voice in the coffee shop, saying, "I'm sorry, Claire, I really am." I thought I understood now what she'd been warning me about. I called Sandra at 6 in the morning. She answered immediately. I think she'd been awake. I told her what happened. There was a brief silence, and then she said, "Don't say anything to anyone about your suspicions. Not yet. Let the investigation lead. If you name her now, it gives her attorneys a narrative to work with. Let the evidence build." I understood. I put the phone down and looked at the charred line where my fence had been. Inspector Diaz called me mid-morning with a preliminary finding. The lab had confirmed hydrocarbon residue consistent with a petroleum-based accelerant at 2 points along the fence base, approximately 15 feet apart. The fire was officially ruled arson. Chandler PD was opening a criminal investigation. A detective named Alvarez would be in contact. I wrote down the name and sat down at my kitchen table and looked at the wall for a long time. Lily had spent the night at Dale and his wife Helen's house. They'd offered immediately, and I'd accepted because I needed her somewhere safe while I processed this. When Helen brought her home that afternoon, Lily walked into the kitchen and looked at me and said, "Someone burned our garden on purpose, didn't they?" It wasn't a question. I said yes. She nodded slowly, the way she processes hard things, and said, "Are you going to figure out who?" I said yes. She said, "Good." Detective Alvarez came to the house on Thursday. He was thorough, unhurried, and had clearly reviewed the fire investigation report before arriving. He asked me to walk him through the past year, the violation notices, the lien, the snap election, the resignation, the truck Gilbert had mentioned. I told him everything, calmly, with dates and documentation. He took notes and did not react visibly to any of it. Before he left, he said, "Do you have a name you want me to look at?" I gave him Margaret's name. I also gave him Gilbert's contact information about the truck sightings. I gave him Sandra's number for the legal files. I gave him Kevin Park's name as a board witness to the conflict timeline. He thanked me and said the investigation was now a criminal arson case and that I should not attempt to contact or confront any persons of interest. I told him I understood. I had no desire to confront anyone. I had learned, slowly and expensively, that documentation was more powerful than confrontation. Sandra reached out to the AG's office immediately. The arson investigation and the fraud investigation were now potentially intersecting. If Margaret had committed arson to drive me off the property in the context of an ongoing fraud scheme to acquire land, that transformed the fraud charges into something with a more serious violent crime dimension. The AG's attorney handling the fraud case asked Sandra for a full briefing. They met on Friday. The neighborhood was watching now. Not secretly, not cautiously, openly. People stood in their driveways and talked. Gilbert and Rosa came by with food. Renata offered to have Lily stay for sleepovers on nights when I needed to focus on the case. Kevin texted a long message that ended, "I'm sorry this happened. The neighborhood owes you something it doesn't have words for yet." Martha Green left a manila folder on my doorstep with a note. Added to the file. She won't walk away from this one. The access road behind the southeast parcels was examined by the arson investigators within 48 hours of my conversation with Detective Alvarez. They found tire impressions in the soft soil near the entry point, consistent with a medium to heavy truck. They also found a partial footprint and a small piece of plastic that would later be identified as a fragment from a commercial fuel container. The access road camera, a city-installed wildlife monitoring camera near the drainage easement, had been triggered twice in the week before the fire. The camera footage was not high resolution, but it was enough to show a vehicle, a dark-colored pickup truck, parked at the access road entry at 11:43 p.m. on the night of the fire. The vehicle had no plates visible in the footage, but the make and model were identifiable. A Ford F-250, dark blue or black, with a service ladder rack in the bed. Detective Alvarez ran the description against vehicle registrations in Maricopa County. The first match that came up for a dark F-250 with a service rack registered in the area was in the name of Holloway Green Services, LLC. I didn't find out about the truck match for 4 more days. In the meantime, Margaret had retained a second attorney, a criminal defense specialist from Phoenix named Gerald Sims, who had a reputation for high-profile, high-cost defenses. His appearance in the case was noted by Detective Alvarez's team and by Sandra. Hiring Gerald Sims was not the act of someone who thought they were being investigated for something minor. Cheryl called me again. Her voice was completely different now. Not careful, but direct, stripped of its usual hesitation. She said she'd been interviewed by Detective Alvarez the previous afternoon. She'd told him everything she knew. She'd been in contact with the AG's office for 2 weeks. She had been issued a formal immunity agreement in exchange for full cooperation. She sounded on the phone like someone who had put down something very heavy. She told me one thing that I hadn't known. 3 nights before the fire, she had been at Margaret's house for what she thought was a routine errand, dropping off documents. Margaret had been on the phone in her office, speaking in a low voice, and hadn't realized Cheryl had come in through the side entrance that was usually unlocked. Cheryl had heard part of the call. She had heard Margaret say, "The shed is the problem. If the shed goes, she loses the state appeal and the lot becomes actionable. It needs to happen before the AG moves." Then a pause. Then, "Just make sure it's clean." Cheryl had told herself, standing in that hallway, that she hadn't heard what she'd heard. She'd left without announcing herself. She hadn't slept properly in 2 weeks. She'd almost called me the morning after the fire and hadn't. And then Detective Alvarez had knocked on her door. And now she'd given him her sworn statement, including every word she'd overheard. I held the phone and felt a cold clarity settle over everything. Sandra filed a motion with the Maricopa County Superior Court to expand the civil case to include arson-related damages and civil conspiracy. The motion was accepted. We now had a civil case with teeth that ran parallel to the criminal investigation. At the AG's office, the fraud case was accelerating. The preservation orders had frozen enough assets to suggest they were preparing for a formal indictment. The timeline was converging. But Margaret was not done. I had underestimated her capacity to keep moving even as the walls closed in. And I think, in a way I still struggle to fully explain, she had stopped being purely calculating and had become something more dangerous. She had become someone who believed she was entitled to win, and that the rules that governed everyone else simply did not apply to her. That belief made her reckless in a way that pure calculation alone never would have. 2 weeks after the fire, someone vandalized my driveway. In the night, someone had spray-painted in large red letters, "Leave." I photographed it before washing it off. Filed a report with Chandler PD. Detective Alvarez added it to the file. Sandra noted it in the civil case. I didn't tell Lily about it until after I'd washed it away. I told her someone had painted something on the driveway. She asked what it said. I paused and said, "Something silly." She looked at me like she didn't entirely believe me. She was right. I updated my home security system, added 2 exterior cameras covering the south boundary and driveway, shared the feed access with Detective Alvarez and with Dale Pruitt, who had set up his own camera system after the fire and was watching my property from his kitchen window with a dedication that I found simultaneously touching and sobering. The neighborhood was on alert now. People took turns, informally, keeping an eye on things. Margaret's house, meanwhile, showed no external signs of anything. Her lawn was maintained by a different company now, not Holloway Green, which had lost its HOA contract when the new board voted to require competitive bidding. Her lights came on and went off at normal hours. She drove in and out of her driveway. She was visible and unremarkable and utterly still in the way of an animal that knows it's being watched. The southeast parcels, the 15 rental villas that made up Margaret's largest private investment, were fully occupied. I'd never paid much attention to them. They were on the far side of the community, nice enough-looking buildings, always with cars in the driveways. Her tenants were mostly professionals on 12-month leases. I thought about them sometimes, people living in homes owned by a woman who was about to be indicted, who had no idea. Detective Alvarez asked me to come in for a follow-up interview on a Wednesday. He told me, with careful precision, that the investigation had generated sufficient evidence to present to the Maricopa County DA's office for charging consideration. He told me that the timeline he'd established, the truck evidence, the camera footage, Cheryl's sworn statement, and additional forensic findings from the fire scene had been assembled into a formal case file. He asked me if I had any additional information to contribute. I gave him the access road photos I'd taken back in October, which he hadn't had. He thanked me and told me to maintain the security protocols I'd already put in place, keep records of any additional incidents, and not discuss the status of the investigation with anyone outside my legal team. I asked if I should be concerned about my safety. He paused before answering and said, "We are taking appropriate precautionary measures," which was not the same as saying no. I drove home slowly and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Sandra and I had dinner at her office that Thursday evening, working late. She spread the civil and criminal timelines on the conference table side by side. On the criminal side, arson charge likely, fraud indictment pending, possible additional charges tied to the conspiracy evidence. On the civil side, lien-related damages, tortious interference with my business, fraudulent HOA enforcement, potential class action standing if the other affected homeowners chose to participate. She outlined what a settlement might look like if the criminal case forced Margaret's assets into a negotiated resolution. The villas, Sandra said, tapping the southeast parcel on a map. 15 units, valued at approximately $4 million in current market. If the criminal case results in asset forfeiture related to fraud proceeds, those villas are subject to seizure. The civil plaintiffs, you, Martha, the Torres family, the others, have standing to make claims against those assets. For $1 million distributed among 7 families who'd been preyed upon. The math wasn't straightforward, but the principle was. I thought about Rosa Torres doing her cancer treatment while Margaret sent her violation notices. I thought about the others. I was sleeping better but not well. Lily had started asking more questions, careful questions, the kind that showed she'd been thinking about the situation longer than she'd let on. She asked one evening whether Margaret was going to go to jail. I said I didn't know, but it was possible. She considered this and said, "Jail seems bad, but so does what she did." I said that was a fair summary. She went back to her homework. I thought, she is going to be fine. Whatever happens with any of this, she is going to be fine. The first week of December brought cold nights and a development I hadn't anticipated. A local investigative journalist named Tom Parrish, who covered suburban real estate and municipal governance for a Phoenix news outlet, reached out to me by email. He said he'd been following HOA-related fraud stories across the state and had picked up on the public court filings. He asked for an interview. I sent the email to Sandra. She said, "Not yet. Not until the criminal charges were filed." I wrote back to Tom and said I was interested in talking but needed to wait for the right moment. He said he understood and would be in touch. Tom's interest told me the story had escaped the confines of Maplewood Estates. Public court filings were public. The AG's preservation orders were part of the record. Anyone who looked would see the pattern beginning to assemble. Margaret's attorneys would know this too. The window before public exposure was closing, and Margaret, someone who had always controlled the narrative, was about to lose control of the biggest story in her life. Robert Holloway hired his own attorney, separate from Margaret's criminal defense team. The separation of their legal representation was noted by Sandra and by the AG's office as a signal that they might not present a unified defense, that one or both might be considering cooperation deals. Robert had been the hands of the operation while Margaret was the authority. Neither would want to be the sole face of accountability. The negotiating would start soon. I kept working, took on a new project, a community garden redesign for a park in Mesa, and found that the work settled something in me that had been unsettled for months. Designing spaces for people to grow things in was, I realized, exactly what I needed to be doing with my hands and mind while the legal process did its slow, grinding work. Lily came to the site visit and sat on a boulder and sketched the layout in her notebook with quiet concentration. Martha Green called me one evening, and the tone of her voice told me before she spoke that something had happened. She approached me, Martha said. Margaret called me directly. She wants to meet. I asked what for. She said she wants to discuss a resolution. Her word, resolution. There was a pause. I said, "Don't meet without your attorney present." Martha said, "Obviously." Another pause. "Do you think she's trying to settle?" I said I thought she was trying to find out how much we had. Martha consulted her own attorney. She'd retained someone separate from Sandra for her personal claims, and declined the meeting. Margaret's next move was to send a formal settlement offer through Gerald Sims to Sandra. A payment of $28,000 to me personally, a mutual non-disclosure agreement, and a withdrawal of all pending civil claims. In exchange, she asked for cessation of cooperation with any governmental investigation. Sandra called me as soon as it arrived. I could hear her trying not to laugh. The offer was, legally speaking, almost comically inadequate and possibly an obstruction of justice problem in itself. asking a witness to cease cooperating with a government investigation in exchange for money. Sandra flagged it to the AG's office. The AG's office added it to the file. We didn't respond to Sims's offer at all. Not responding was itself a message. I imagined Margaret getting that silence back and not knowing what to do with it. January arrived cold and dry. Lily went back to school after winter break. I finished the Mesa project. The criminal case was, according to Sandra's contacts, in its final pre-filing stage. The AG's fraud case was coordinating timing with the DA's arson filing to ensure simultaneous or near-simultaneous charges, the kind of coordinated action that sends a message and makes bail negotiations harder. Someone was being careful and deliberate, and it was not Margaret. I hadn't been back to the south side of my property since the fire. I'd walked past the cleared area, the charred fence posts I hadn't yet replaced, the surviving bougainvillea that had grown back despite the heat damage. It was a stubborn plant. I appreciated that. But I hadn't stood in that spot and looked at it properly. One Saturday morning in January, I walked out there alone, early, before Lily woke up. I stood at the edge of the burned area and looked south toward the strip of city easement land where Margaret had started unauthorized grading. The desert beyond the easement was still and quiet in the early light. A cactus wren called from somewhere in the brush. The creosote smelled clean and cold. I thought, she tried to take this from me. She tried to use fear, law, money, and fire to make me leave. And I'm still standing here. On my land. In my home. I stood there for a long time without thinking anything specific, just existing in the place she had wanted to erase me from. Then I went inside and made coffee. Sandra called that afternoon with the update I'd been waiting for. The Maricopa County DA's office had reviewed the arson case and confirmed they were proceeding with charges. The formal filing was expected within 2 weeks. Simultaneous to the criminal filing, the AG's office would announce the fraud indictment. Both offices had coordinated timing. Margaret and Robert Holloway would be arraigned on the same day. 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks of this particular quiet before the world shifted again. I used them well. I had Sandra prepare my victim impact statement for the criminal proceeding. I coordinated with Martha and the other affected homeowners to ensure they were represented and had counsel ready for the civil claims. I called Tom Parrish and told him 2 weeks. Have your story ready. He didn't ask why. He said he would. Kevin Park called to tell me the HOA had formally voted to commission a full legal review of Margaret's entire tenure, with the intent of pursuing HOA-level recovery of the improperly authorized vendor payments. The HOA itself was now a claimant. The community, the actual community, the people who lived there, was asserting itself against the person who had spent 11 years claiming to speak for it. There was something deeply satisfying about that. Margaret's house was quiet. Robert's truck hadn't been seen in the neighborhood in 3 weeks. Cheryl had moved out of her apartment. I heard from mutual contacts that she'd gone to stay with family in Tucson. The southeast parcel's tenants were going about their lives, unaware that the legal status of the buildings they lived in was about to become uncertain. I thought about whether someone should warn them. Sandra said, "Not yet. Don't create noise." The night before the charges were filed, I sat at the kitchen table after Lily was asleep and wrote a list. Not a to-do list, just a list of things that had happened in the past 14 months. The planter boxes, the certified letters, Cheryl's apology, Gilbert Torres in the parking lot, Sandra's office on Elliott Road, the snap election, 61 people walking in through the clubhouse door, the fire investigators' orange markers in the dark, the truck footage, Cheryl's voice saying, "It needs to happen before the AG moves." I read the list twice and then folded it and put it in the back of my binder. Evidence of a year of my life. I thought about what I had wanted when I moved to Maplewood Estates. A house with space, good light, a garden, somewhere to raise my daughter in a neighborhood that felt safe and ordinary and real. I thought about all the other people who'd wanted exactly the same thing and had run into Margaret Holloway in the process. 7 families, possibly more that we hadn't found. People who had lost money, sold under pressure, moved away from houses they'd loved because one person had decided that their property was a chess piece in her financial game. I thought about the fact that it hadn't been inevitable. Someone could have stopped Margaret years earlier, if the right person had pushed back at the right moment, if the right evidence had assembled, if the fear that kept people quiet had cracked a little sooner. I thought about what Renata had said on my second week. She does this to people she wants gone. The knowledge had existed in the neighborhood for years. It had just been too heavy to lift alone. I thought about the night of the fire, Lily's arm in my hand, Biscuit at the front door, the orange glow beyond the south wall. I thought about the careful, deliberate person who had decided that burning down part of my property was a reasonable and appropriate response to the problem I represented. I thought about the conversation Cheryl had overheard. It needs to happen before the AG moves. That wasn't desperation. That was calculation. And it was wrong in a way that went past illegality into something personal and permanent. The next morning, a Thursday, cold and bright, Sandra called at 7:45 and said, "They filed." The Maricopa County DA's office had filed charges against Margaret Holloway for arson in the first degree, criminal conspiracy, and solicitation to commit arson. The AG's office had simultaneously filed a 31-count fraud indictment against Margaret Holloway, Robert Holloway, and 2 associated LLCs, charging wire fraud, HOA fiduciary breach, and real estate fraud affecting 7 identified victims over 9 years. The arraignment was scheduled for the following morning. Margaret Holloway, HOA president, self-appointed authority over Maplewood Estates, the woman who had sent me 23 violation notices in 5 months, who had tried to lien my property, who had orchestrated the burning of my fence and garden shed, who had tried to buy my silence for $28,000, would be standing before a judge with her hands folded and her careful face arranged just so, and none of it would be enough anymore. I called my mother in El Paso. She cried a little. I didn't. I think I'd used up the crying months earlier, somewhere between the certified letters and the orange markers in the dark. I felt instead something quieter and more solid, a specific kind of justice-adjacent satisfaction that isn't quite joy because the damage is real, but is unmistakably, undeniably the right ending to a wrong story. Tom Parrish's story went live that afternoon. He'd been thorough and careful, citing public documents, named sources including several of the affected homeowners who had agreed to go on record, and a statement from the AG's office confirming the indictment. The headline was, "HOA President Faces Arson and Fraud Charges After Years of Alleged Land Acquisition Scheme." It included photos of the burned fence line. It included my name. I read it in my kitchen and thought, good, let it be visible. By evening, the story had been picked up by 2 Phoenix TV stations and a national real estate law newsletter. By the following morning, it was trending on several HOA-focused community forums where, it turned out, many people across the country had stories that rhymed exactly with ours. Hundreds of comments. Hundreds of people saying, "This happened to me. This happened to my family." I read some of them and felt both grief and a strange, expansive solidarity. Sandra called me that evening. She sounded energized in the measured way of attorneys who are winning. The civil case just got 3 additional victims wanting to join as plaintiffs, she said. The story found people we hadn't found yet, and 2 of them have documentation we didn't have. 10 families now. 10 families whose losses were on the record. 10 families who would have standing against Margaret's assets when the criminal case resolved. I checked the southeast parcels on the HOA property map that night. 15 villas, for $1 million in market value. Frozen by the fraud indictment's asset seizure provisions, now that the indictment was filed. Margaret's tenants would receive notice of the asset freeze within days. The management company handling the rentals would be required to inform them. 15 buildings, for $1 million, and the legacy of 11 years of deliberate, systematic cruelty toward neighbors who had just wanted to live in their homes. What happened next was not something any of us had predicted. Not Sandra, not Martha, not Detective Alvarez. We had assumed that the filing of charges would force Margaret into a defensive posture. Attorneys negotiating, assets frozen, public profile decimated. We were right about all of that. What we hadn't accounted for was what Margaret would do in the 48 hours between the charges being filed and her arraignment. We underestimated the depth of her refusal to simply accept what was happening. I found out about it in pieces, the way you find out about things that happen in the dark. The first piece was a call from Detective Alvarez at 11 p.m. on Thursday, the night before the arraignment. He asked if everything was normal at my property. I said yes. He said to keep the security system active and to call him immediately if anything seemed unusual. I asked what was going on. He said, "We're monitoring a situation. I'll update you tomorrow." I didn't sleep. The second piece was a call from Kevin Park at 6 in the morning. He'd been woken by a notification on the HOA's property management app. An alarm triggered at the utility access point for the southeast parcel. He'd called the app company for details and been told a maintenance override code had been used to access the utility shutoffs at the southeast parcel storage building. The code was registered in Margaret's name. She had accessed it within the past hour. Kevin called Chandler Fire Department non-emergency and reported a potential hazard at the southeast parcels. Then he called me. Then he called Detective Alvarez. Then he drove to the southeast parcels himself, against what I suspect was his better judgment, arriving to find that the access road gate to the parcel maintenance area was standing open and that the storage building where the utility shutoffs were housed smelled strongly of gasoline. He called 911. He got out of there. He stood in the street 2 blocks away and waited. Chandler Fire arrived in 6 minutes. Chandler PD arrived 2 minutes after that. The storage building was identified as an active fire risk. Accelerant had been applied to a large portion of the interior, and evidence of an attempted ignition had failed when the lighter mechanism used by the perpetrator malfunctioned. Someone had tried to burn the utility building and hadn't been able to get it started. But accelerant had also been found at 2 of the villa foundations. Not fully applied, not ignited, whoever had been there had run out of time or nerve. The gasoline smell was heavy in the air. Chandler Fire declared the area a hazardous scene and began the process of evacuating the 15 villas. Tenants in robes and pajamas stood on the street at 6:30 in the morning, holding phones and dogs and confused children, watching fire trucks position around their homes. Detective Alvarez called me at 6:45. He told me what had happened in the controlled, precise language of a law enforcement officer delivering information that is alarming but must be presented calmly. Margaret had attempted to burn the southeast parcels, her own villas, the assets frozen by the indictment. If she couldn't have them, and if the state was going to use them as restitution for her victims, she was apparently willing to destroy them before the arraignment. A spasm of destruction dressed as power. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Biscuit came over and put his head on my knee. I heard Lily moving around in her room upstairs. She woke early, always had, and I made a decision in that moment that I was going to sit on the kitchen floor for exactly 90 more seconds, let myself feel whatever I was feeling, and then get up and be a functioning adult. I gave myself 90 seconds. Then I got up. The attempted arson of the southeast parcels was a separate criminal act from the original fire at my property. Detective Alvarez told me Margaret's attorneys had been notified. Gerald Sims, her criminal defense attorney, had apparently told her not to do anything unilateral before the arraignment. She had done it anyway. which told me something about what had happened to her decision-making in the past 48 hours. The formal charges had broken something in her, not her guilt or her calculation, but her control. Police located Margaret at her home at 7:15 in the morning. She was dressed, sitting in her living room, with her purse in her lap, as if she were waiting for a bus. Gerald Sims was present. She was placed under arrest for the new attempted arson charge, in addition to the existing charges. She was taken out through her front door in handcuffs. A neighbor 3 houses down saw it happen and called Dale, who called me. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I thought I would feel triumph or relief, or the specific catharsis of seeing consequences arrive visibly and completely. Instead, I felt something more complicated, something adjacent to sadness, not for Margaret, but for the fact that this was what it took. That 11 years and 7 families and a burned garden and a child asking if her home was safe. All of that had been necessary to bring one person to this specific morning in this specific doorway. The arraignment went forward that morning at the Maricopa County Superior Court, now with a 3rd criminal charge added. Margaret appeared in court in civilian clothes, hair perfect, expression neutral, the specific composure of someone who has lived their entire adult life managing how they look to others, performing calm as a survival mechanism. The judge denied bail on the arson charges given the new attempt and the flight risk assessment. Margaret Holloway was remanded to custody. I found out about the bail denial from Sandra, who had been in the courtroom. She called me from the parking lot afterward, and I could hear in her voice something that was not quite professionalism. Something warmer and more human. She said, "She's in custody. Bail denied. Arraignment complete. Trial date pending." I said thank you. A long pause. Then Sandra said, "You built this case, Claire. You and Martha and every person who decided to stop being afraid." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said thank you again. The Southeast parcel tenants were given temporary housing assistance by the city while the properties were assessed for safety and the legal status was clarified. The asset freeze was confirmed by the court. The villas were intact. The attempted fire had been stopped before it caused structural damage. $4 million in assets frozen, pending the outcome of the fraud case. The tenants were told they would be able to return within days. Most of them expressed bewilderment and something like relief that their homes still existed. News vans were in Maplewood Estates by 9 that morning. I didn't speak to any of the reporters directly. Sandra had advised a brief statement through her, which said, "We are grateful for the work of the Chandler PD, the Arizona Attorney General's office, and every community member who had the courage to come forward. We will have more to say at the appropriate time." Tom Parrish updated his story. By noon, it had been picked up nationally. By evening, it was on cable news. I watched none of it. I took Lily to school, came home, took Biscuit on a long walk through the desert trails behind the neighborhood, and let the morning sit inside me at its own pace. The creosote was sharp and alive in the cold air. A roadrunner shot across the path in front of us, which Lily would have considered very exciting if she'd been there. I thought about her in class right now, probably drawing something in her notebook, unaware of what had happened this morning. I would tell her tonight. I would tell her exactly what to tell her. Martha called that afternoon. She was matter-of-fact in the way she always was, but her voice had a warmth it hadn't had before. "She tried to burn her own villas," Martha said, "to keep the victims from getting them." A pause. "That's the last act of someone who has run out of moves." I agreed. Another pause. "You did this, Claire. You know that." I said we did it. She said yes. We. The civil case accelerated in the wake of the bail denial and the second attempted arson. Margaret's legal team, now managing 3 criminal charges plus the fraud indictment, reached out to Sandra about a global settlement. This time the offer was different. No NDA, no gag clause, a specific dollar amount tied to asset liquidation from the seized villas, and acknowledgement of the harm caused to the identified victims. It wasn't enough yet, Sandra countered. Negotiations began in earnest. Robert Holloway cooperated fully with the AG's office in exchange for a reduced charge and restitution obligation. His attorney confirmed this through public court filings. He had been the operational layer of the scheme, the LLC vehicles, the vendor contracts, the off-market acquisition offers. He gave the AG's office everything they needed to close any evidentiary gaps in the fraud case. Margaret's defense, already compromised by the new charges, lost whatever benefit it might have had from a united front. I attended a community meeting in January that the new HOA board organized. Not a formal board meeting, but an open gathering, an accounting, a chance for the neighborhood to process everything that had happened. 68 homeowners came. Dale and Helen Pruitt sat in the front row. Gilbert and Rosa Torres sat together near the center. Renata was next to me. Kevin ran the meeting with quiet competence. Martha sat at the side with her binder, as always. People talked for 2.5 hours. Some of it was practical. What happens to the HOA now? What does the legal process mean for the community's finances? Some of it was personal, individual stories of violations, pressures, interactions with Margaret that had felt wrong at the time but had been swallowed. Some of it was something harder to name, the grief of having lived in a community that had been used as a vehicle for exploitation, and the work of deciding what to make of it going forward. An older woman named Patricia, who had lived in Maplewood for 22 years, stood up and said, "I knew something was wrong. I knew it years ago, and I was afraid, and I didn't do anything." The room was completely quiet. She said, "I want to say that to the people who did something. I want to say I know what it cost you, and I'm sorry it took this long." She sat down. Kevin thanked her. Nobody else said anything for a moment. Then the room started talking again, but in a different register. I said something near the end of the meeting. I hadn't planned to. Kevin called on me because I had my hand up before I fully realized I'd raised it. I said, "I almost sold. I want everyone to know that." There were weeks when I thought it would be easier to just go. When the lien was active and the letters were arriving and the legal fees were adding up and Lily was asking questions, I thought about it. I didn't sell because my neighbors told me the truth, because people who'd been through it told me what it actually was. The reason I'm here is because of the people in this room. I sat down. Renata squeezed my arm. The legal proceedings would take another 8 months to fully resolve. I knew that going in. Criminal trials are slow, and this one had multiple charges, multiple defendants, and the complexity of the fraud case layered underneath the arson charges. But the trajectory was clear. The evidence was comprehensive. The witnesses were numerous and documented. Gerald Sims entered plea negotiations in February. By March, the outline of a resolution was visible. Margaret eventually pleaded guilty to 2 counts of arson, criminal conspiracy, and 3 counts of wire fraud. The plea was negotiated. It kept the case from a jury trial that the evidence made essentially winnable for the prosecution, and gave Margaret some credit for resolution. But the sentencing range was substantial. Sandra and the AG's attorney both submitted victim impact statements. The statement from Rosa Torres, quiet, factual, describing what it was like to receive violation notices during chemotherapy, was particularly devastating to read. I submitted my own victim impact statement. I described the planter boxes and what they had meant to me. Something I had made with my own hands in a new place, trying to make it home. I described Lily's question on the night of the fire, and the night I had stood in the burned garden in the early morning and decided I wasn't leaving. I described what it meant to have a space in which you belong, and what it meant to have someone try systematically to take that from you. I kept it factual. I didn't need to be dramatic. The facts were dramatic enough. The sentencing was scheduled for spring. In the meantime, The civil case reached a settlement. Margaret's frozen assets, including the southeast parcel villas, were liquidated through a court-supervised sale. The proceeds, after legal costs, were divided among the 10 victim families in proportion to documented losses. The Torres family received enough to substantially offset what they'd lost on the forced sale of their second property. Rosa Torres called me the day the settlement was confirmed. She cried. I let her. Sometimes that's what the moment calls for. The southeast parcel villas sold in a court auction in April. All 15 of them to 2 separate buyers, a development group and a couple from Tucson who bought 5 units as rental income properties. New ownership, new management. The tenants who'd been there during the attempted fire, most of them stayed. New leases. A fresh start for 15 homes that had been instruments of a scheme for years without knowing it. Maplewood Estates, in the aftermath, was quiet and somewhat raw. The HOA had new governance, new processes, new bylaws explicitly prohibiting board members from holding financial interests in HOA contractors. Kevin Park was elected to a full 2-year term. Martha Green joined the Architectural Review Committee and brought her binder. The community, slowly and imperfectly, began to become what it had always meant to be, a neighborhood, rather than one person's financial instrument. My garden came back. Not the same. The bougainvillea didn't survive the second season, and I planted a different climber in its place. A ladybank's rose that bloomed yellow in late winter. The desert willow filled out more than I'd expected, leaning toward the sun with a kind of determination I found personally resonant. The lantana came back exactly as before, orange and yellow, unstoppable, as if nothing had ever happened to it. Lily grew 3 inches that year, as if trauma had been converted directly into height. She made 2 new friends in the neighborhood, girls who came over after school and sat in the kitchen and drew elaborate floor plans of imaginary houses with her while I worked in the next room. The sound of their voices through the wall, specific, animated, entirely unconcerned with anything adult and complicated, was the best sound I'd heard in a year and a half. I called Sandra in May just to check in, not for legal purposes. She was working on another HOA case in Tempe. She said there were more of them than she'd like. Patterns like this one in varying scales across the state. The systems are there to protect people, she said. But they only work when people use them. A pause. Most people don't know they can push back. They think the HOA just wins. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. I started a blog. Not about the legal case, I'd agreed to certain limitations in the settlement, but about HOA rights, documentation strategies, Arizona statutes, the specific practical steps that let an ordinary homeowner engage effectively with a system that's often designed to overwhelm them. Nothing dramatic, just information, clearly organized, written for someone who just received their first violation notice and doesn't know where to start. Within 3 months, it had more readers than I expected. Tom Parrish wrote a follow-up piece in April, after the sentencing. He quoted the judge, who had said during sentencing that Margaret's scheme had represented a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in community governance, executed with deliberate intelligence over a decade, and harmful to a degree that extended well beyond the financial losses. 7 to 12 years, eligible for parole after 5. Robert Holloway, 3 years, suspended, plus restitution and a 5-year ban from HOA governance. Margaret Holloway was 57 years old when she was sentenced. She had spent 11 years in that community, building something that looked like leadership from the outside and was extraction from the inside. She had a husband who had enabled her, an assistant she had used up and discarded, neighbors she had manipulated, and at least 7 families whose lives she had materially damaged. And somewhere in all of that, she had a neighborhood she could have simply lived in. A neighborhood that might have genuinely respected her if she'd ever wanted that instead. I don't know what she wanted ultimately. I don't know if she told herself she was building something legitimate or if she always knew exactly what she was doing. I don't know if she has people in her life who were genuinely her people, or if every relationship she had was instrumental. I looked at her photograph in Tom's article, the one taken at the sentencing in civilian clothes, same composed expression, and I tried to see something in it. Couldn't. What I know is this. She made a decision about my land and my house and my daughter's home, and she pursued that decision with intelligence and persistence and ultimately with fire. And the fire was her undoing. Not because she was stupid, but because she had never truly believed that the thing she was building could actually come apart. She had mistaken the absence of visible opposition for the absence of consequence. She had confused silence with consent. The access road behind the easement was closed by the city in June, pending a formal drainage easement study. The unauthorized grading was fully remediated at Margaret's expense through the settlement funds. The entrance feature project, the one she had been working toward for years, the reason for 7 families' displacement, was formally rejected by Chandler's Planning Commission in a 2-sentence letter. Not enough community support. Not consistent with land use guidelines. Done. I went to the zoning commission meeting where the project was officially rejected. Sat in a folding chair in a fluorescent-lit room in the Chandler City offices and watched a city planner read the rejection into the record. Nobody in that room knew that this 2-sentence determination was the endpoint of 11 years of deliberate fraud against 7 families. The planner moved on to the next agenda item. I walked out into the parking lot and stood in the evening sun for a moment before getting in my car. The desert willow on the south boundary bloomed in May, small, orchid-like flowers in soft pink and white, trembling in the afternoon wind. I took a photograph of it and sent it to Sandra, to Martha, to Renata, to Gilbert and Rosa Torres. No caption, just the photograph. Renata replied with a single emoji, a small sun. That seemed exactly right. Title? She torched my land to drive me out. The fire burned down her 15 villas instead. But before all of that resolution, before the sentencing, the desert willow blooming, Lily's new friends in the kitchen. There were the final days when Margaret still believed she could reverse the outcome, when she had not yet tried to burn the villas, when she was still in her house with Gerald Sims and a plan she thought might work. Those days I didn't know what was coming. I was preparing for the arraignment, trying to sleep, watching my security cameras. And she was deciding how far she was willing to go. The night before the arraignment, Margaret made phone calls. I know this from the investigation, call records subpoenaed as part of the arson case. She called her husband 3 times. She called Gerald Sims 4 times. She called a number that was later identified as a former contractor for Holloway Green Services. A man named Darcy Wills who had done odd jobs for the company and whose connection to the accelerant found at the original fire at my property was never fully proven but remained under investigation. Darcy Wills had no comment. Margaret had already made her decision by then. I woke that morning, the day before everything broke, to Biscuit growling quietly at the back door. It was 4:15. I lay still for a moment, listening. Nothing unusual reached me. The neighborhood was silent. The security monitor showed no motion alerts. Biscuit sometimes growled at coyotes passing the south fence. I told him to settle. He lay down but kept his head up, ears forward, watching the door. I lay there watching the ceiling until 5 a.m., then gave up on sleep. I made coffee at 5:15 and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with the security monitor in front of me, cycling through the 4 camera feeds. South fence, driveway, front walk, back porch. Everything was still. The desert beyond the south boundary was gray-dark and quiet. The cameras had excellent night vision, something Sandra had recommended after the original fire, and the images were crisp. Nothing there. Nothing at all. I was tired in a specific way that went beyond sleep deprivation. The months of sustained alertness, the constant low-level preparedness, the habit of documentation, the background calculation of every development, had accumulated into a kind of bone-deep fatigue that brief good nights didn't touch. I thought, after tomorrow, after the arraignment, maybe there will be a day soon where I wake up and don't immediately check my phone. Lily came downstairs at 7, surprised to find me already up and already dressed. She poured herself cereal and asked if I was nervous about tomorrow. I said a little. She said, "You don't need to be. You did everything right." I looked at her over my coffee cup and felt something that doesn't have a clean name. Not pride exactly, more like witness. I was witnessing this child know exactly the right thing to say and mean it fully without performance. I drove Lily to school and took the long way back, through the desert edge roads that ran behind the eastern parcels. Out of habit now, I'd taken to driving. The perimeter of the neighborhood once a day, an informal surveillance loop that had begun after the fire and had become something between routine and ritual. Everything looked normal. The southeast parcels were quiet. Early morning, most tenants still home, cars in the driveways. The southeast parcel storage building was a squat, flat-roofed utility structure at the back corner of the parcel, housing the master shutoffs for water, gas, and electrical for the villa complex. I drove past it without stopping, as I did every morning. The gate to the maintenance access path was closed, as it should be. Nothing out of place. I continued home and parked and went inside to work. Sandra called at 10 to confirm logistics for the arraignment. We would not be in the courtroom personally. Victims weren't required at arraignments, and Sandra recommended against it for optics and emotional management. We would receive real-time updates from the courthouse. I would be at home, working, staying calm. Lily would be at school. The process would proceed as processes do, indifferent to how anyone felt about it. I had a project call at 11, a residential landscape consultation in Scottsdale, and spent an hour discussing client vision and site constraints with professional focus. The client was a recently retired couple redoing their backyard, enthusiastic and specific and completely absorbed in their own project, which was refreshing. An hour of caring fully about someone else's plants and drainage plan and patio placement was, I discovered, exactly what I needed. After the call, I updated my case binder, a final habit, almost a reflex now, adding notes from the previous day's correspondence. The binder was thick and organized and represented 14 months of careful attention. I looked at it for a moment and felt something. Not relief, it wasn't over yet, but the specific satisfaction of someone who has done the work correctly. I closed it and put it back in the cabinet. Detective Alvarez called in the early afternoon to confirm the arraignment was on schedule. He asked, as he had daily for the past week, whether there had been any unusual activity at or near my property. I said no, nothing since the vandalism, which had been almost 3 weeks ago. He said good and told me to call him immediately if that changed. His voice had its usual professional calm, but underneath it I heard the specific quality of someone who is watching something they expect to move. Renata texted at 2. "Tomorrow it's real. I'm making enchiladas. Come over after." I said yes. Normal plans. Forward-facing plans. The kind of plans you make when you believe the worst is behind you. I made a grocery list for the week, a mundane, optimistic act, the act of someone who expects the future to be ordinary and manageable and their own. I picked up Lily at 3:30. She was in a good mood, had gotten a strong grade on a science project, was animated about something a friend had said. She talked all the way home without stopping, which I loved. Her talk was a river that moved fast and changed direction without warning, and you had to stay in it to follow. I stayed in it all the way up the driveway. We made dinner together. She went to bed at 9 without complaint. I watched television for an hour, something I rarely did, just to have sound and light that wasn't about any of this. Cooking show. Someone was very upset about a soufflé. It was precisely the right level of stakes for what I needed. I turned it off at 10:30 and did a final camera check. Still quiet. South fence, driveway, front walk, back porch, still, dark, empty. I updated the security log, locked the doors, set the alarm, and went to bed. I slept until 2:10. Then my phone lit up. It was Dale Pruitt. I knew from his voice before he finished his first sentence that something had happened. Not at my property this time, but somewhere that I would care about. He said, "The southeast parcels. There are fire trucks. Kevin just called me. Someone tried to burn the villas. I was already sitting up. I didn't go there. I wanted to, but I called Detective Alvarez first and he told me very clearly to stay at home, keep the cameras running, and wait." He said, "She may not have finished." I understood what he meant. If Margaret had targeted the villas, she might also have planned something at my property, the original target, the one that had started everything. I stayed. I sat in the kitchen with the monitor in front of me and watched all 4 feeds simultaneously. The cameras showed nothing. The neighborhood on my end was still. But the southeast parcels, 11 blocks away, beyond my camera range, were lit up in a way I could see as an orange glow over the roofline when I stepped onto the back porch for 2 minutes. Fire trucks. Emergency lights. 68 families worth of neighborhood. Awake at 6 a.m. because of one person's decision to burn something she felt she was losing. Kevin's texts came in a stream. Utility building. Accelerant found. Failed ignition. 2 villa foundations. Tenants evacuating. Police on scene. Gate was open. Code used from registered account. I read them one by one, each adding a layer to the picture. She had done it herself, or directed it done with the same access code that was tied to her registered account. Either way, the evidence trail was immediate and direct. For all her intelligence, in the end she had used her own credentials. Detective Alvarez called at 6:43. He told me Margaret had been located at her home. He told me she was being taken into custody. His voice was precisely level and professional and contained no editorial content whatsoever, which was exactly right. He was an officer delivering facts, not a narrator delivering satisfaction. But when he said, "She's in custody," I heard in those 3 words the weight of everything that had gotten us there. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the security monitor. South fence. Still standing, replacing the burned posts from 3 months ago. Good solid new lumber. Driveway. Lily's bicycle leaning against the garage wall, dew on the handlebars. Front walk. The potted aloe by the front door, healthy, green, 3 feet tall. Back porch. Biscuit's water bowl catching the early light. My house. My land. Still mine. Sandra called at 7:15 and her voice had the specific quality of someone delivering information they have waited a long time to deliver. She told me about the arraignment, the bail denial, the 3rd charge. She told me in her careful, complete way, leaving nothing out as she always did. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." A pause. Then she said, "Get some breakfast, Claire. Eat something." I said I would. I meant it. I made eggs. Scrambled, which is what Lily liked, so I made enough for when she woke up. I turned on the kitchen radio. NPR, morning news, the ordinary world continuing in its ordinary way, and I made eggs and toast and poured juice and set the table for 2 and waited for my daughter to come downstairs. Biscuit sat next to the stove in the hopeful way of a dog who has identified the eggs as a probable target of opportunity. The morning was cold and bright and entirely, unremarkably real. Lily came downstairs at 7:45. She looked at the table and then at me and said, "You made breakfast?" I said yes. She sat down and started eating without asking why, which was a very Lily response. Accepting good things without demanding explanation. About halfway through her eggs, she looked up and said, "Did something happen last night?" I said yes. She said, Is it over? I thought for a moment and said, almost. She nodded and went back to her eggs. I took her to school and drove home slowly. The neighborhood was coming to life in the ordinary way. People walking dogs, someone backing out of a driveway with the particular focused abstraction of a person running late, a mail truck at the corner. Ordinary, intact. The kind of morning that exists on the other side of something. Martha called at 9. She'd heard from Kevin, who'd been up since 5. Her voice was different from her usual careful precision. There was something warmer in it, something more openly human. She said, I've been waiting for this for 3 years. I started keeping records because I was afraid no one would believe me. I'm sitting here looking at them right now. A pause. 7 families, Claire. I said, 10 now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 10. Sandra had a call with the AG's attorney at 10. The new attempted arson charge, she told me afterward, significantly strengthened the prosecution's overall case. It demonstrated a pattern of behavior so consistent that even the prosecution's most conservative evidentiary arguments now seemed understated. She handed them the case, Sandra said. She had attorneys. She had a plan. And then she did this. I asked why Sandra thought she'd done it. Sandra said, because she never believed she'd actually lose. I spent the rest of the morning at my desk, working. The Scottsdale consultation notes needed to be written up. There was a site visit to schedule in Mesa. Normal professional life going forward, while legal machinery did its necessary work in the background. I found I could focus. That was new, or returning, rather. Focus had been hard for months. Something had loosened. Gilbert Torres came by in the afternoon with Rosa, who had driven from Tucson where they'd temporarily relocated. She was in good health, better than she'd been at the worst of the violation campaign. I could see it in her face. We sat in the living room and I made tea and we talked about the arraignment, about the coming trial, about what resolution might actually look like for their family. Rosa said, quietly, I just want it to mean something. I want the fact that we went through it to mean something. I told her it already does. The news cycle had picked up the morning arrest. By noon, the story of Margaret's attempted villa arson was running everywhere, overlaid on the previous day's indictment story. It was a remarkable narrative, the dramatic final act of a scheme years in the making, the perpetrator destroying her own assets rather than see them returned to the community she'd preyed upon. People in HOA forums, legal blogs, real estate news outlets were all discussing it. The story had become something larger than Maplewood Estates. I read some of the coverage that afternoon. I read about myself in third person. Claire Navarro, landscape architect and original complainant, had her fence and garden shed set alight in November, and felt the specific strangeness of being a character in a story that other people were reading. I thought about the people who would read this and recognize their own stories in it. I thought about the woman who would read it in the middle of a violation notice campaign and think, someone pushed back. Someone won. I can too. The news cycle created pressure on Gerald Sims and Margaret's defense team that accelerated the timeline toward resolution. When a case becomes a national story about HOA corruption, the path to a dignified jury trial effectively closes. The jury pool becomes saturated, the political will to prosecute intensifies, and the prosecution's leverage in plea negotiations increases dramatically. Sandra noted this with quiet satisfaction. The story was doing work that we couldn't do in court. Kevin Park sent me a message that evening. The HOA board is passing a formal resolution tomorrow to send a letter of appreciation to the AG's office, the Chandler PD, and to you personally. Unanimous vote. I stared at the message for a long time. 11 months ago, I had stood at that microphone in the community clubhouse and read my statement about selective harassment, and the room had been watching me with the careful neutrality of people who wanted to believe but weren't sure yet. Now the board was voting to thank me. Same room, same neighborhood, different reality. I couldn't sleep the second night. Not from anxiety, the acute anxiety was gone. I was simply awake, in the way you're awake after something long and difficult has finally visibly turned. My mind was processing in the background, running over everything, threading connections, noting details. I lay in the dark and thought about Cheryl standing in Margaret's hallway, hearing words she didn't want to hear, and not knowing for months what to do with them. I thought about her decision to call Sandra. One phone call, the weight of it. At 3 a.m, I got up and went to the back porch. Biscuit came with me. The desert night was cold and enormous and full of stars, the kind of star visibility you only get in Arizona on clear winter nights, when the air is dry and the light pollution doesn't reach. I stood there for 20 minutes and let the scale of it settle over everything. The case, the neighborhood, the burned fence, the seized villas, the woman sitting in a county holding facility 11 blocks away. All of it under the same sky. All of it moving toward whatever it was going to become. The morning of the arraignment, the first one before the new charge, I dressed carefully. Not for the courthouse since we weren't attending, but because of what the day meant. Some days deserve the small ceremony of putting on good clothes. I made French toast for Lily, who ate it with the focused happiness of someone for whom French toast is a sufficient reason to find a morning worthwhile. I watched her eat and thought, I would do all of it again, every certified letter and lean and sleepless night, for this. For her being here safe at this table. When Detective Alvarez called at 6:40 to tell me about the southeast parcel situation, I was ready. Not prepared, no one could be prepared, but ready in the sense that I had done everything I could do to be standing on solid ground when whatever happened next arrived. I took the call standing at the kitchen window, looking at the south fence, the new lumber, the morning light on the desert willow. I heard him out. I said okay. I stayed. The southeast parcel evacuation, I learned later, was remarkably efficient. Kevin had called 911 the moment he saw the open gate and smelled the gas. The fire department's hazmat team cleared the area in under 15 minutes, going door to door with the specific urgent comm of professionals who have done exactly this before. Every one of the 15 villas was evacuated safely. 62 residents stood on the street in the cold and watched professionals assess their homes for fire risk, and not a single one was hurt. The failed ignition was the pivot point. Whoever had applied the accelerant, the investigation would focus intensely on Margaret's movements in the 4 hours prior, had used an ignition device that malfunctioned. Fire investigators would later determine the device was a commercial-grade trigger mechanism that had been improperly assembled or damaged before use. The accelerant was present. The intent was present. The execution failed. 62 people were standing in their homes this morning because of a malfunction. I stood on my back porch and looked south toward the glow of the emergency lights. I thought about the 15 villas, homes where people woke up, made coffee, argued about weekend plans, came home tired and left in the morning. People who'd been living inside Margaret's financial structure without knowing it. People who would wake up today and find out that the woman who owned their homes had tried to burn them down. I thought about what that felt like from the inside of it. The fire investigators worked the southeast parcel scene for 6 hours. They documented the accelerant application pattern, the failed ignition points, the access path evidence. The city installed wildlife camera on the drainage easement, the same camera that had shown the truck before the original fire at my property, had been triggered again. This time the footage was clearer. The timestamp was 4:52 a.m. The vehicle in the footage was a dark F-250 with a service rack. The vehicle was found 2 miles from the southeast parcels, parked on a residential street, 2 hours after the scene was secured. It was the truck registered to Holloway Green Services. Inside the truck, 2 empty commercial fuel containers, both matching the partial container fragment found at the original fire site at my property. Work gloves with traces of the same accelerant compound. And on the passenger seat floor, a failed ignition device, commercial grade, with a manufacturing defect in the trigger mechanism. Detective Alvarez showed me photographs of the interior months later, after the criminal case had resolved. I looked at the fuel containers and the gloves and the broken trigger device and felt something settle permanently into place. The full, undeniable material proof of everything that had been done. Not inferred. Not documented through financial records and testimony. Sitting in a truck cab on a residential street in Chandler, Arizona, at 8 in the morning. Margaret's arrest at her home was brief and without incident, per every account. Gerald Sims was already there. He'd driven over when she stopped returning his calls that morning. He watched them put the handcuffs on. By all accounts he said nothing, which was the correct professional response and probably also a moment of reckoning for an attorney who had been very well paid to defend something that was now entirely indefensible. I didn't watch the news coverage of the arrest. I know there was footage. A neighbor's doorbell camera caught the police cars and the walk to the vehicle. It circulated widely. I didn't watch it then, and I haven't watched it since. The arrest was the legal mechanism, the necessary procedural event. What mattered to me was not the moment of handcuffs but the accumulation of 14 months that made that moment possible. Sandra arrived at my house that afternoon with a bottle of very good Sonoma Pinot Noir. She didn't call ahead. She knocked on the door, held up the bottle and said, "You're not going to drink this alone." I laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from the body rather than the decision to laugh. We sat on the back porch in the cold with the wine and watched the desert light change and didn't talk about the case much. We talked about other things. It was the first time since I'd hired her that Sandra felt like a person rather than a professional function. I appreciated that. Renata came over that evening with the enchiladas she'd promised, and Martha came, and Kevin and his wife, and Dale and Helen Pruitt. Nobody planned it. People just arrived, the way neighbors arrive when something important has happened and the right response is proximity. Lily sat in the middle of the kitchen with Kevin's 12-year-old daughter and Renata's nephew who was visiting, and they ate enchiladas and ignored the adults entirely, which was the best possible outcome. We sat around the living room and talked through everything that had happened, the timeline, the court filings, the attempted villa fire, what came next. Someone made coffee. Someone else cut a cake that Helen had brought. It was past 10 before people started leaving. I stood at the door and watched them go to their cars and thought, this neighborhood is real. It always was. Margaret didn't build it and she couldn't break it, and everything she did was ultimately just noise against something that was stronger than she understood. The arraignment itself, the formal reading of charges before the judge, took 40 minutes. Sandra sent me a live text commentary from the courthouse observer position. Margaret appeared in civilian clothes, composed, as always, counsel present. Charges read: arson first degree, criminal conspiracy, solicitation to commit arson. Then the new charge from the morning's events. The judge's voice reading them into the record was, per Sandra, entirely flat, judicial neutrality, the legal equivalent of consequence without editorial. Bail was denied on the flight risk assessment. Sandra's text read, denied. She stays. 2 words. I read them in my kitchen while Lily was upstairs doing homework. I set the phone on the table and put both hands flat on the table surface, cool tile, solid, completely real. I stayed that way for a moment. Then I picked up the phone and texted back, "Thank you." Sandra replied, "For what? You built this." I put the phone down. Outside, the desert willow was moving in the afternoon wind. The days immediately after the arraignment had a strange quality. The pressure had released, but the aftermath hadn't yet resolved into ordinary life. Every day brought some legal update, some piece of fallout, some new development in the interlocking fraud and arson cases. Sandra and I spoke daily. The southeast parcel tenants were being managed through the asset freeze process by a court-appointed property manager. The villas were structurally sound. No actual fire damage had occurred. The tenant's relief was palpable in every communication that came through the management company. Tom Parrish called to say his story had generated significant mail, emails, and messages from people across the country who had experienced similar HOA-based predatory schemes. He had enough material for a series. He asked if I'd be willing to speak on the record for a follow-up. I said I would, with Sandra's sign-off. He asked what I wanted people to know. I said that it's possible to push back, that documentation is power, that the systems exist to protect residents, but residents have to use them. A woman named Beverly from Scottsdale emailed me through my blog, which had launched 2 weeks earlier, almost on impulse, and which had already received more traffic than I'd expected. She said she'd been living in her own violation nightmare for 8 months and hadn't known what to do. She'd read Tom's article. She'd found my blog. She'd spent a weekend reading through my documentation strategy posts and had written her first formal response letter to her HOA. She said, "I don't know if it'll work, but at least I'm not just taking it anymore." I read her email twice and then wrote back, "That's exactly it. You're not just taking it anymore." The fraud trial, when it came, was thorough and methodical and lasted 11 days. The prosecution presented the full chain: the LLC structure, the property acquisition timeline, the violation notice campaigns correlated with sale pressure, the financial flows, the vendor contracts with the conflict of interest documentation, 10 victim families, 9 years of documented activity. Robert Holloway's cooperation testimony, delivered with the flat precision of someone who has decided that candor is cheaper than loyalty. Cheryl's testimony, steady, complete, devastating in its specificity. Margaret's defense argued that the HOA enforcement was legitimate, the business relationships disclosed, the LLC activities lawful independent real estate investment. Gerald Sims was professional and thorough. The jury was not persuaded. The verdict came in after 8 hours of deliberation. Guilty on 24 of 31 counts. The remaining 7 were either dismissed or resulted in hung counts that the prosecution chose not to retry. 24 convictions. Sandra called me with each count as it was announced. I was gardening when the last count came through. I had my phone in my jacket pocket, the garden gloves on. The Lady Banks rose in front of me that I was training up a new trellis along the south fence. My phone buzzed. I read the text. 24. I set the phone on the garden wall and looked at the rose canes and the new lattice and the desert willow overhead and thought, okay. 24. Sentencing was 3 weeks after the verdict. The courtroom was more crowded than for most sentencings in Maricopa County Superior Court, which Sandra said was unusual and attributable to the public attention the case had received. Family members, journalists, several of the affected homeowners. I sat in the gallery with Martha on one side and Renata on the other. Lily was at school. This was not a place for children. Margaret entered the courtroom and I saw her in person for the first time since the snap election, 9 months earlier. She looked the same and she didn't. The composed bearing was intact, the precise dressing, the careful face. But something was different that I couldn't articulate until later, driving home. The room was not responding to her. She walked in and the room simply absorbed her presence without adjusting. She had spent 11 years in a room where her presence reorganized everyone else. That was over now. The victim impact statements were read into the record. Rosa Torres' statement was presented in writing, as Rosa chose not to appear. The court reporter read it with professional neutrality, and the specificity of it, the names of the medications she was taking when the violation notices started arriving, the exact amount they paid their HOA attorney during her treatment, the morning she decided to sell because she couldn't fight both things at once, landed in the courtroom like something physical. I heard someone behind me draw a breath. My own statement was read by Sandra, at my request. I had written it carefully and revised it 3 times, trying to be accurate rather than dramatic, because the drama was already in the facts. When Sandra finished reading, the courtroom was quiet for a moment before the judge spoke. The judge said, "The defendant demonstrated a sophisticated, sustained, and deliberate disregard for the rights and well-being of her neighbors and community. The harm extends beyond the financial losses, significant as those are, to the fundamental sense of security and belonging that homeowners have the right to expect in their own neighborhoods." Margaret sat with her hands in her lap and her face arranged just so, giving nothing away. 7 to 12 years. Eligible for parole after 5. The sentence was read into the record and Margaret's expression did not change. Not one visible adjustment. I thought, even now she is performing. Even this she is trying to manage. And then I thought, that is her prison separate from any building. And then I let that thought go because it didn't matter anymore. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright March sun and stood on the steps with Martha and Renata and Sandra and felt the desert warmth on my face after 3 hours in an air-conditioned room. Sandra said nothing. Martha said nothing. Renata put her arm around my shoulders. The 4 of us stood there for a moment in the sun and it was enough. It was more than enough. Kevin texted from the HOA. Board just passed a resolution renaming the South Garden easement Community Reclamation Strip. Unanimous vote. Your idea to plant it gets a formal budget. I hadn't actually proposed an idea about the strip. Kevin had apparently interpreted my interest in the south boundary as a proposal. I texted back, "I'll design something." He replied, "We know you will." Tom Parrish's sentencing article ran the next morning under a headline that was, appropriately, more restrained than the original. HOA president sentenced to 7 to 12 years in Arizona's largest HOA fraud case. Nationally syndicated. Quoted in the Wall Street Journal's real estate section. Cited in a federal housing policy discussion paper. One woman in one neighborhood in Chandler, Arizona, and the ripple of it going further than any of us had imagined when I was sitting at that kitchen table composing my first formal response letter to a planter box violation. I got an email from the Arizona HOA Homeowners Alliance, an advocacy group I hadn't known existed, asking if I would speak at their annual conference in Phoenix. They wanted me to talk about documentation strategy, community organizing, and the legal tools available to homeowners facing predatory HOA governance. I said yes. Sandra said she'd come too. Martha said she'd bring her binder, which I thought was perfect. The conference was in April, a Saturday morning, in a hotel ballroom in downtown Phoenix. About 300 people attended. Some of them were attorneys and advocates. Most of them were regular homeowners who'd been through something. Varying degrees of what I'd been through, some milder and some worse. I stood at the podium and looked at them and thought, every single person in this room has a house somewhere that matters to them. That is the starting point. I talked for 40 minutes. I talked about the planter boxes. I talked about the binder. I talked about Sandra and Martha and Kevin and the 61 people who showed up to the snap election. I talked about what documentation actually is. Not just paperwork, but the material record of a person's right to exist in their own space. I said, the HOA doesn't own your home. You do. The rules exist to serve the community, not to extract from it. When the rules are being weaponized, they can be fought. It takes time and it costs something. But it can be done. You can push back and win. Afterward, a man in the 3rd row came up to me. He was maybe 60, heavy-set, with the careful eyes of someone who had been through something. He said, "I've been fighting my HOA for 2 years. I almost gave up last month." He stopped and looked at the floor for a moment. "I'm not giving up now." He walked away before I could respond. I stood there with that for a minute. Then Martha appeared at my elbow with her binder and said, "Good talk." Which, from Martha, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Spring settled over Maplewood Estates like a kind of permission. The desert gardens that had been dormant through winter were coming alive. The brittlebrush, the penstemon, the yellow blooms of Palo Verde trees along the streets. People were outside more. Yard work, bike rides, the specific pleasantness of an Arizona spring before the heat arrives. The neighborhood felt different in a way that was hard to specify. Lighter, maybe, more itself. The southeast parcel villas were under new ownership by April. The court-supervised sale had taken 6 weeks. New owners, new management company, new lease agreements for the existing tenants who chose to stay, which was most of them. One couple who'd been there through the evacuation morning told the new management they were staying specifically because of how the transition had been handled. Transparent, prompt, professional. They said, "It's the first time we felt like tenants instead of collateral." I heard this from Kevin, who heard it from the new management company rep at a board meeting. Lily and I planted the South Garden fully in April. Desert willow, Lady Banks rose, Texas sage, yellow alyssum along the border, and a patch of native wildflower seed mix that would bloom in whatever order it chose. We worked in the afternoon light, kneeling in the soil, getting dirt under our fingernails. Lily had opinions about placement. I incorporated most of them. By the time we finished the south boundary, the 30 feet of land that had been the original target of everything, the reason for the violation campaign, the lien, the fire, was covered in living things. The AG's press conference announcing the fraud conviction was held in Phoenix in April, 3 weeks after sentencing. The Attorney General spoke about the case as an example of what systematic HOA governance abuse looked like. Sophisticated, sustained, financially motivated, and enabled by community silence. He thanked the witnesses and the investigative team. He mentioned that the case had prompted new legislation in the Arizona State Legislature. A proposed HOA Transparency and Enforcement Act, adding penalties for retaliatory enforcement and mandatory financial disclosure requirements for board members. The legislation passed in June, signed by the governor in a ceremony at the state capitol. It was called HB 2247. Sandra was invited to the signing. Martha and Kevin attended. I was in Mesa finishing a project installation but watched the live stream from my truck in the parking lot on my phone. The governor said, "Arizona homeowners deserve governance that serves the community, not exploits it." He signed it with 3 pens. One of the pens was given to Sandra. She framed it. Robert Holloway's cooperation had been complete enough that his suspended sentence was confirmed. 3 years suspended, restitution payments structured over 5 years, a permanent ban from HOA governance and from serving as an officer or owner of any HOA contractor entity in Arizona. He sold the house in Maplewood and relocated. His departure from the neighborhood was quiet. A moving truck on a Tuesday morning. Nobody waved. Cheryl relocated permanently to Tucson, near family. She had cooperated fully, her immunity agreement held, and she faced no charges. She sent me a card in May, a plain white card with a desert scene on the front. Inside she wrote, "I should have called sooner. I know that. I'm sorry for every day I didn't. No signature necessary." I knew her handwriting by then. I put the card in the back of my binder, behind the folded list I'd made the night before the arraignment. The Maplewood Estates HOA was restructured through a formal governance reform process assisted by an Arizona HOA legal consultant. New bylaws, new conflict of interest policy, financial transparency requirements, an independent oversight committee with rotating membership elected directly by homeowners, not the board. The community voted on every amendment, in person and by mail ballot. Turnout was 71%, the highest in the HOA's history. Kevin told me this with the quietly satisfied air of someone who has seen what community engagement actually looks like when people feel like it matters. Sandra filed the final civil settlement documentation in May. The distribution of the liquidated villa proceeds went to 10 victim families, structured proportionally to documented losses and adjusted for inflation and legal costs. My share, accounting for the shed replacement value, the business losses from client interference, and attorney fees, came to $47,000. More than I'd lost. Sandra had fought hard in the negotiation. I used some of it to finish the south garden wall I'd been planning for 2 years and gave the rest to Lily's college account. The Torres family received $82,000, the largest single distribution, accounting for the forced sale loss and the demonstrable stress-related costs during Rose's medical treatment. Gilbert called me the morning they received the confirmation. He was quiet for a long time and then said, "It doesn't undo it." I said, "No." A pause. "But it's something." I said, "It's something real." He said, "Yeah, we didn't need more words than that." Martha Green was elected to the HOA board in the first election under the new bylaws. She ran on a one-item platform: financial transparency and documented governance. She won with 68% of the vote. At her first board meeting, she placed her binder on the table in front of her and opened it to the first page, which was a typed set of principles she drafted about what HOA governance was supposed to be for. She read it into the record at the start of every meeting. Kevin told me this with visible admiration. Detective Alvarez sent me an email in June, professional, brief, but warm in the way that professional brevity can be warm. He said the investigation had been one of the more complete cases he'd worked in his career, that the documentation contributed by the community had been exceptional, and that he hoped things had settled for me and my family. He mentioned the new HOA law. He said, "Cases like this one make those happen." I wrote back and thanked him, a real thank you, for the specific work of a specific person who had done their job with care. Tom Parrish published the final installment of his series on the case in July. He had interviewed 24 people across the country with HOA-related fraud experiences similar to mine. He had spoken with legal scholars, former HOA board members, and advocacy groups. The series was nominated for a Regional Journalism Award. In the final installment, he asked me what I would say to someone facing what I'd faced in month 1. The first certified letter, the first sense that something systemic was happening. I said, "Document everything. Find one person who tells you the truth. Then find another. The evidence you need already exists. You just have to be patient enough to build it into something that can't be ignored." Margaret Holloway began serving her sentence at a state facility in Yuma. The logistics of this were not something I tracked. I knew what I needed to know from the public record, and the public record said the sentence was real and the consequence was commensurate, and that was sufficient. I didn't feel triumph in the daily fact of her incarceration. I felt something more final, the specific quiet of a situation that has been completely resolved and can now be set down. The entrance feature project was formally removed from all Maplewood planning documents in June. The drainage easement was restudied by the city and confirmed to require no modifications. The access road gate was permanently closed and the code system decommissioned. The strip of land along my south boundary, the 40-foot easement that had been the origin of all of this, the thing Margaret had wanted badly enough to run a decade-long fraud scheme for, was reclassified as a permanent natural easement buffer and planted by the city with native desert species. I walked along that strip one morning in early summer. The native plantings were still small, just getting established: brittlebrush and desert marigold, a few young Palo Verde saplings that would take years to reach any size. But they were there, growing slowly, quietly, as desert plants do. The strip that had been the pretext for a campaign against 7 families, for a fire at my property, for 15 villas frozen and sold, it was just land now. Good, dry, honest desert land growing ordinary things at its own pace. My blog had, by midsummer, become something I hadn't entirely planned for. A genuine resource, not a large readership by internet standards, but consistently the right readership. Homeowners in the middle of HOA conflicts, looking for specific, actionable information. I answered emails personally when I could. I maintained a resources page with links to Arizona statutes, documentation templates, and legal aid organizations. Once a week, I published a post on a specific aspect of HOA governance or self-advocacy. It was useful work. It mattered to the right people. One email stood out from the others. It came in August from a woman named Sylvia in Columbus, Ohio. She said she'd been through a 3-year HOA campaign in her neighborhood, had documented everything following guidance from my blog, had taken it to her local housing authority, and had successfully gotten her HOA board removed and restructured. She said, "You didn't know me and you helped me anyway. I want you to know it worked." I read this email at my kitchen table at 7 in the morning and started crying in the specific way you cry when something is simply, unreservedly good. Biscuit came over and put his head on my knee. Some things don't change. Lily started middle school in August. She was nervous in the way of someone facing a genuinely new environment and pretending to be less nervous than she was. The particular architecture of 11-year-old pride. I drove her the first morning and watched her walk through the entrance with her backpack, head up, her grandmother's stubbornness in the set of her shoulders. I sat in the car for a moment after she disappeared inside. Then I drove home and went to work. The south garden was extraordinary by August. The desert willow was 4 feet tall and had produced 2 full blooms. The ladybank's rose had taken the trellis completely and was sending canes in directions I hadn't planned for but liked. The wildflower seed mix had produced a chaotic, wonderful tangle of color, orange and yellow and deep pink, that attracted hummingbirds in the afternoon. I had planted it in the place where my cedar fence had burned. In the place where someone had put accelerant and struck a match to drive me away from my home. I thought about Renata's early advice. Document everything, get on the meeting agenda, find allies. Simple, practical, correct. I thought about Sandra's voice the first day we met, saying, "She's creating grounds for a lien." I thought about Martha appearing in the parking lot after the September board meeting with her legal pad, saying, "I think we need to talk." I thought about 61 people walking into the clubhouse on a Sunday morning because they'd decided something mattered enough to show up for. This is what communities are when they work. This is what they can do. Kevin Park sent me a photo in August. The new entry sign for Maplewood Estates, installed at the main gate. Simple, clean design, good materials, no grand entrance feature. Just the neighborhood's name and a small native plant motif that one of the new board members had designed. Nothing Margaret had planned. Something the community had chosen for itself. I looked at it and thought, small, appropriate, real. The arson charge, the original fire at my property, resulted in a separate civil judgment in addition to the criminal sentence. The judgment covered replacement value for the fence and shed, the cost of the new camera system, the garden losses, and a punitive element for the emotional harm and the deliberate nature of the act. The total was $94,000. It would be collected against Margaret's non-frozen personal assets, which her attorneys were managing through the sentencing process. Sandra said collection would take time. I said that was fine. I replaced the fence in October. Not cedar this time, but a desert-appropriate block wall with an iron gate, better fire resistance, and a clean horizontal line that let the garden breathe. The gate faced south, toward the strip of city land that was now growing native plants at its own measured pace. I stood back when it was done and looked at the south boundary of my property. My wall, my gate, my garden behind it, and felt something that was specifically the opposite of what Margaret had intended for me to feel standing here. I felt at home. The last message I got from anyone connected to that side of the story was a text from Gerald Sims's office, informing me that as the civil judgment was now final, the collection process for the arson damages would begin. Standard legal communication. I filed it. The last message I got from my own people, from the neighborhood, was an invitation from Kevin to the Maplewood Estates fall block party. The first one in 4 years, the board having decided it was past time to act like neighbors. The block party was on a Saturday in October. Mild weather, long shadows, the smell of grills and someone's citrus tree carrying in the air. 60-some households, kids running everywhere. Biscuit on a long leash, aggressively attempting to socialize with every dog present. Lily found her friends immediately and disappeared into the neighborhood's back spaces with the total freedom of a child who feels safe in a place. I stood with Dale and Renata and Martha and watched it, this ordinary, specific, irreplaceable thing. People who live in the same place, choosing to be in the same place together. Dale said something near the end of the evening that I've kept. He was looking at the neighborhood going about itself in the last light. Conversations, children, the easy movement of people who know each other. And he said, "This is what it was supposed to be. Just that. This is what it was supposed to be." I didn't add anything to it. It didn't need anything added. By winter, the legal proceedings had fully concluded. All sentences finalized, all civil claims settled, all assets redistributed. The HOA operated under its new bylaws with new leadership. The affected families had received their portions of the recovery. The legislation was law. The journalism had circulated and done its work. What remained was ordinary life. Complex, imperfect, daily, real ordinary life in a neighborhood that had been broken and had put itself back together. I was still tired. The kind of tired that takes a long time to leave because it built up slowly over a long time. Some nights I'd wake at 2 or 3 and do a camera check purely on muscle memory, and then lie there reminding myself it was over, the binder was closed, the fence was stone now. The tiredness would lift, Sandra told me slowly, the way it comes. I believed her. I practiced patience with myself the same way I'd practiced it in the case, methodically with documentation of progress. The most unexpected aftermath was the people. Not the legal outcomes or the financial resolution or even the legislation, though all of those mattered, but the people who had come through this with me and around me and because of it. Martha with her binder at every board meeting. Kevin running a community with genuine care. Gilbert and Rosa in Tucson calling occasionally, Rosa now organizing her own advocacy group for patients navigating HOA conflicts during medical crises. Cheryl somewhere in Tucson, hopefully lighter. Renata 2 doors down, always with food and truth in equal measure. Sandra, framing the governor's pen. The woman named Beverly from Scottsdale who wasn't just taking it anymore. Lily asked me something in December, sitting at the kitchen table while I was finishing a project proposal and she was doing math homework. She asked, "Do you think she knew she was doing something wrong? Or do you think she thought she was right?" I put down my pen and thought about it seriously, the way she deserved. I said, "I think she knew the rules said no, and she decided the rules didn't apply to her. I think that's different from thinking you're right. I think that's thinking you're above it." Lily considered this for a long time. Then she said, "That's worse." I said, "Yes, it is." She went back to her math. The desert willow moved in the evening wind outside the kitchen window. The house was warm. I walk the south boundary some mornings before the neighborhood wakes. My fence, my gate, the growing strip of native plants beyond, the desert opening out past that in the cold early light. I think about the planter boxes that started it, about the binder getting heavier, about 61 people walking through a door on a Sunday morning, about orange markers in the dark and a truck on a camera and Cheryl's voice in a coffee shop and Sandra saying you built this, about all the things that had to happen before the truth became visible and how long the truth was there waiting for someone to stay. I stayed. That was the whole thing, really. I stayed on my land, in my home, in my life, and eventually, piece by piece, the rest of it came apart on its own. The end.